41. True Magic Stone. Dumbledore watched the rare, near-dazed look on Roger's face with a satisfied smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. It wasn't often he managed to leave such a brilliant student speechless. He let the moment linger, then explained with a small, knowing smile. The Philosopher's Stone isn't a stone, Roger. It's an invisible magical gate, a rift that tears the fabric of space and time and connects to a source of pure magical power. That is why it can pour out endless magic. Roger mentally slapped his forehead. Of course, who said the Philosopher's Stone had to be a literal stone? And in the original account, the stone was destroyed just days after Harry stopped Quirrell and Voldemort? That had always struck him as absurd. A treasure that could continuously pour out magic couldn't be casually destroyed. They should have worried about the magic leaking and blowing up Hogwarts. Destroying Voldemort's Horcruxes had required incredible effort, specific tools, and precise timing. They wouldn't have been able to destroy something as potent as the stone so easily. The logical conclusion, the Philosopher's Stone wasn't a physical stone at all. Then what did Voldemort steal? Roger asked. Dumbledore answered slowly, as if choosing each word. Although the Philosopher's Stone is an invisible gate, it requires an anchor in the physical world. That stone is simply the coordinate where the magic projects. The invisible stone pours its vast power into that anchor, making it seem like a sink of infinite magic. So you can cut off the magic supply to that stone? Roger reacted instantly. Precisely. Dumbledore met his eyes. The moment I saw Tom, I sent word to Nicholas Flamel. By now, he should have closed the magic channel. As if to prove it, the object in Roger's trouser pocket, pressed against his thigh, immediately lost its humming surge and became ordinary under his hand, just a plain pebble. Roger's inner tirade erupted. After all that effort, after risking his life to protect it, it turned out to be a useless rock. He had gained nothing and had almost been taken over by Voldemort. Dumbledore's precaution was brilliant. Even if Voldemort had physically taken the object, they could cut off its power and render it harmless. Viewed that way, the whole thing had been a trap tailored for Voldemort. If Dumbledore hadn't allowed him a taste of the immortality potion to restore some strength, Voldemort might have been finished that night. In the original tale, he fled, leaving Quirrell behind, and only later, through long plotting, managed to return. Here he'd escaped with Quirrell and would surely regroup with his followers to plan his comeback. Dumbledore fell silent for a moment, brows creased. He hadn't always been the man he was now. In his youth, he had been a fervent, hot-blooded idealist who flirted with dangerous ideas of blood purity and the dark arts, and he had once been dangerously close to the dark wizard Gellert Grindelwald. He nearly became Grindelwald's partner, only to eventually change course, a transformation more dramatic than Roger's own recent turn. That was why Dumbledore had watched Roger so closely at first. He recognized the same troubled crossroads. After a long pause, the old man spoke again. How did you know Tom made Horcruxes? Roger was ready. He laid out what amounted to the future Dumbledore's own deductions. My first real lessons in magic came from the Unforgivable Curses, so I've studied soul magic. Voldemort tried to tempt me by boasting he'd gone further than anyone down the road of the soul, promising immortality, and he even hinted that you couldn't kill him. The only thing that fits that description is a Horcrux. Splitting one's soul makes a person more whole to themselves, but also more extreme and paranoid. Voldemort now fits that profile exactly. I bluffed him, watched his reaction, and from that, I concluded it was almost certain. Dumbledore was silent again, then fixed Roger with a sharp look. Your judgment is correct, but do not let Harry know about this. I understand, Roger said, and then ventured, you suspect that Harry himself is a Horcrux? Dumbledore's pupils narrowed, and a rare flash of shock crossed his face. The boy had thought of the same possibility Dumbledore had only just considered. For a moment, the memory of Voldemort's assessment, that this child has the makings of a Dark Lord, echoed in his mind. Fortunately, Dumbledore thought, Roger was far likelier to grow into a force for good. Dumbledore had already suspected, long before, that Voldemort hadn't been entirely destroyed and that Horcruxes were involved. He had sealed the restricted books on Horcruxes in Hogwarts' library himself. Roger's account only reinforced his fears. but Dumbledore still needed evidence beyond Harry, which meant a long trip might be necessary over the summer. Watching the old man's solemn expression, Roger felt the weight of it and couldn't help saying, "You don't have to carry everything on your shoulders. Voldemort's deeds aren't yours alone to bear." Dumbledore looked up, surprised by the boy's calm sincerity. "We are all adults," Roger continued evenly. "You have to be responsible to yourself first. Always dumping responsibility on others or taking everything on yourself, neither is maturity. The latter especially. It only drives people away and ruins real relationships." Dumbledore sighed deeply. His eyes, pale blue and full of years, regarded Roger with a complexity that seemed to span decades. After a long moment, he waved a hand warily. "Go back, child. Tell no one of tonight's events." Roger hesitated at the door, struck by the old man's loneliness. He had intended to ask more about Horcruxes and whether the process could be inverted, devouring other souls to strengthen one's own or to increase magical power. But as his hand touched the handle, Dumbledore called after him. "The ban on your study of the dark arts is lifted," the headmaster said, his voice returning to its usual composed tone. "The restricted section will be open to you. I will explain the arrangements to Madame Pince myself." There was a trace of warmth in his voice now. "And do you have plans for the summer? Would you like to go away for a bit? Nicholas Flamel told me he would be very happy to host you." He paused, then added with meaning, "Perhaps you should go and see the true Philosopher's Stone." 42. Small Aftershocks. Harry lay in the hospital wing for 3 full days before he slowly woke. During those 3 days, Hogwarts buzzed with rumors. The details shifted wildly, but the roster of protagonists stayed the same. Harry, Roger, Ron, and Hermione, the only 4 who'd been in the ward. Ron and Hermione had only shown up during the first few, relatively tame obstacles, checked over, and left unhurt. Roger had played through the whole trial. When he transfigured into a 3-headed hound, he'd been scorched by the out-of-control fiendfire. Cerberus had an uncanny resistance to magic, though, and a little salve was all he needed. Harry, however, had lain in a deep coma for 3 days. Whether it was the soul connection with Lord Voldemort or the fiendfire's blow, it had taken a terrible toll. Professor Quirrell's sudden disappearance and Snape's temporary takeover of Defense Against the Dark Arts only fed the students' imaginations. In the versions that spread through the castle, Harry naturally played the hero who confronted the villainous Quirrell. Roger was the mighty backup. Ron and Hermione were mostly scenery. Ron had been smug for a moment, thinking he would finally get his share of attention, until he realized the stories reduced him to a tag-along. He'd been roused from the 4th-floor restricted area by Hermione and didn't know what happened after that, so he couldn't fathom why Roger got such a starring part. Roger, for his part, acted as if nothing at all had happened, quietly reading and researching. Dumbledore had issued a strict gag order, and Roger was happy not to talk. When the news that Harry had woken spread, the ward was immediately swamped with curious students. Dumbledore was the first to go in. After a long inquiry, he left. Madame Pomfrey then stood sentinel at the door, turning everyone away. Hermione pleaded until Pomfrey relented and gave them 5 minutes. "Harry, you're awake! You scared us to death!" Hermione rushed in, voice trembling. She forced herself calm and pressed closer, whispering, "That room at the end of the 4th floor. What happened? Was it really you-know-who?" "Yeah, the whole school's talking about it." Ron leaned over as well, putting on the air of an interrogator. "Come on, tell us. What went on in there?" The truth was stranger than any rumor. Harry pressed his throbbing forehead and, still weak, began to tell them exactly what had happened. He had seen Lord Voldemort. He had watched a first-year stand up to Voldemort himself. Hermione and Ron listened without daring to breathe. At every tense beat, they gasped. When Harry reached the part where Voldemort had been using Quirrell and tried to use the stone's power to be reborn in Roger's body, Hermione screamed. "He didn't succeed," Harry said quickly. "Why didn't he succeed?" Ron blurted. "Ron Weasley, do you actually want you-know-who to succeed?" Hermione shot back, but she was already speaking more casually. After the adventure, their relationship had thawed considerably. No, I didn't mean that," Ron protested, flustered and red. "I just want to know how Roger messed up Voldemort's resurrection." "I don't know either," Harry admitted. Even now, the Roger he'd seen in that room felt unreal. Roger's transfiguration, it's very, very powerful. Hermione filled in what she could. Harry had seen Roger fight, and the level of transfiguration had felt inhuman, and there were spells Roger used that Harry couldn't identify, like the incantation that finally stopped Voldemort's rebirth. Harry suspected Roger's strength might already surpass many professors. Ron stared, gobsmacked. "If you ask me," Hermione said bluntly, "his transfiguration probably already exceeds Professor McGonagall's." "What?" Ron's jaw dropped. In his world, Hogwarts professors were near the pinnacle of magic. A student above a professor was almost unheard of. They chatted a little longer about Nicholas Flamel and Dumbledore until Pomfrey interrupted sharply. 15 minutes up. Out, all of you." Under orders from the school, details about Voldemort were tightly controlled. The sanitized version that circulated became, Harry, Roger, Ron, and Hermione had worked together, wit and courage prevailing, to foil Professor Quirrell's plot to steal the Philosopher's Stone. Draco Malfoy, furious that Potter had once again stolen the limelight, responded not with crude insults this time, but with something more Slytherin, scholastic scorn. One evening in the Great Hall, while Ron proudly recounted his turning the tide on the giant chessboard, Draco drooligly sneered, loud enough for everyone to hear. Squeezely, very thrilling indeed. A chess expert. How practical. Pity Hogwarts finals don't test that. I'm worried for some of you. With the pathetic level of charms you and Potter have, can you even pass? I think I saw Longbottom's feather float more steadily than your wand work. Draco's words were an ice bucket to the students. The specter of final exams instantaneously felt real and heavy. Professors seemed to have received the same memo. Classroom discipline tightened, lectures sped up, and review material piled on. Even the usually genial Professor Sprout looked sharp. A moment's daydreaming could mean a reprimand or lost house points. Everyone at Hogwarts appeared subject to the squeeze, except Roger. He often sat in class buried in a book thick enough to fell a hippogriff, and as long as he didn't disturb lessons, the teachers looked the other way. The Philosopher's Stone incident had been a wake-up call for him. He'd nearly been undone by ritual magic. With the restricted section effectively open to him now, Roger dove into everything he could find on ritual work. Ritual magic, he discovered, was an enormous category of ancient magic. It covered everything from summoning spirits to calling rain or conjuring fire. It could be used for battle and for everyday life. Animagus transformations were, in a sense, ritual, and legends of rain prayers in the Muggle world were another form. The deeper Roger dug, the more surprised he was to find references to rituals that could induce hallucinations indistinguishable from reality. Curses, in some documents, appeared to be a branch of ritual magic. Ancient texts described ritual magic vaguely and mysteriously. The closest definition Roger could wring out was that ritual magic was essentially a mapping of magical power. Specific rituals traced certain magical patterns, and those patterns produced particular effects. Roger suspected a connection to the leyline magic the old wizard had mentioned. It reminded him of Voldemort's talk of a world linked by souls. He had a sense that the magical patterns rituals traced came from that other world. The problem was, he couldn't observe that world. Voldemort had taught how to tap its magic through killing, but not anything about the world itself. Without that information, the principles of ritual magic remained obscure. Even the biocomputer couldn't analyze it properly. Roger thought of Flamel's invisible door, which had apparently opened a crack into the magical world. If he could study such a rift up close, maybe he could learn how the stone worked. According to Voldemort's theory, perhaps the Philosopher's Stone was effectively a spatial rift left behind when a living being died. The more he thought about it, the more he looked forward to the trip to France. He shut the heavy book with a soft thud, fingers tapping the table. Before going to France, maybe he could tinker with the levitation charm. Improve it. Simplify a flying spell. A small, practical project to occupy his mind. All right, class dismissed. Professor McGonagall's voice cut through his thoughts. She adjusted the parchment on the podium and gave them a final stern reminder. There are fewer than 20 days until the finals. Use your time wisely. The consequences of failing, Hogwarts expulsion notices, are not pleasant to look at. For the lower years, the end-of-year exams came down to one thing: spellcasting. That was easy enough for Slytherins raised with magic in their bones or quick-witted Ravenclaws. For the industrious but average Hufflepuffs and the restless, easily distracted Gryffindors, the pressure was brutal. Draco Malfoy, in particular, treated the examinations as the perfect opportunity to outshine Harry Potter. The very idea of the Chosen One flunking was irresistible. When Draco set his mind to it, he looked the part. He dragged Crabbe, Goyle, and a few other Slytherins into an intense revision regime. "Why are we killing ourselves practicing?" Goyle groaned, flat on the floor. "Your dad's on the board. Hogwarts can't expel you." "Yeah, I'm knackered," Crabbe echoed, mopping sweat from his brow. Draco slipped his wand into his pocket and lowered his voice conspiratorially. "I'll let you in on something. Do well, and you spend the holidays at Nicholas Lemay Manor. Personal coaching. My father's funding it." "Nicolas Lemay?" Goyle and Crabbe gaped blankly. "Idiot," Draco snapped. "Don't you ever open a book? He's the maker of the Philosopher's Stone." The Philosopher's Stone? The words manor and summer trip brought life back into them. They scrambled up and waved their wands with renewed energy. Their sudden zeal piled more pressure onto the Gryffindor and Hufflepuff younger years. Every spare classroom in the castle became hot property. Study groups sprouted like mushrooms after rain, each scrabbling for a slot. Hogwarts was big enough that empty rooms had never been precious, until now. These days, almost everyone was booked. You had to reserve or risk being shut out. One exception puzzled everyone: Wayne Hopkins. He had hovered near the bottom at the start of term and only clawed his way to mid-table later on. Now, to everyone's shock, his spell work outclassed the year. He was facing the exams with confidence, no frantic cramming required. Cornered by Harry, Ron, and the others, Wayne blurted, "Don't all ask me. Roger taught me." Roger had been buried in the library poring over Horcrux texts for weeks, but after a lot of wheedling, he'd agreed to coach. A spacious classroom had been magically partitioned into cubicles and silenced for privacy. Neville, Seamus, Hannah, Ron, Harry, Hermione, and Kevin took booths, firing spells at targets in steady rotation. Roger patrolled like an inspector, mending shredded practice dummies and offering crisp pointers. Through his biocomputer sight, he could see the flows of magic. Faults were obvious, and advice precise. Harry, smarting from the last time, drilled harder than anyone. Expelliarmus, Diffindo, Reparo in quick succession, wand flashing, eyes fierce. Wayne, drenched in sweat, barked, Reparo at a pile of rubble until the stones knit back together. The joins still showed, but the sight flushed his cheeks with triumph. Roger," Ron shuffled up, his hair a red mop of embarrassment. "I can't even manage a proper hover." He braced for scorn. Roger only smiled and pointed to a nearby rock. "Then start there. Show me." Ron raised his wand stiffly and mumbled, "Wingardium Leviosa." The rock stayed stubbornly on the floor, and Ron's face burned. Using the biofeedback, Roger adjusted the angle of Ron's arm in the path of his wand. "Relax your elbow. Steady arc. Wrist like this. Good. Again. Clear enunciation." Corrected, Ron inhaled, flicked cleanly, and shouted, "Wingardium Leviosa!" The boulder inched grudgingly into the air. Ron gaped, then beamed, alive with the proof that practice could turn into visible progress. Nothing fuels enthusiasm like that. For days, they haunted the practice room after class, and the group's skills shot upward. Soon even Ron, once the weakest, could cast every first-year spell competently. Saturday, supposedly a day off, found the library crammed with upper years in last-minute panic. Roger assumed the practice room would be free and perfect for quiet reading. Instead, he found the lower years inside, huddled in lively argument. "Roger, perfect timing," Hermione called, eyes shining. "We're choosing a name for the group. Come help us decide." Roger stepped over. Scrolls and lists were spread across a table. Hogwarts Magical Advancement Society in Hermione's immaculate hand. Starry-Eyed Club, signed by Wayne. The rest were plain and uninspired, clearly Harry's or Ron's. They all looked up at him with eager, sparkling faces that said his opinion mattered. Roger lifted a quill, a mischievous smile flickering at the corner of his mouth, and across a blank parchment wrote in bold, sweeping letters, "Dumbledore's Army. 44. The Secret of Nicholas Flamel." When the name Dumbledore's Army began to spread, Hogwarts predictably erupted, and even Headmaster Dumbledore was stirred. As a result, Roger Lewis, a first year, found himself summoned to the headmaster's office for an unprecedented third time. Looking into the deep, unreadable blue eyes behind Dumbledore's half-moon spectacles, Roger launched into his prepared speech, waving the banner of the Voldemort threat like a flag. The Dark Lord isn't truly dead. He's at full strength, and a comeback is inevitable. For the future peace and safety of the wizarding world, shouldn't students start practicing spells now? Pause there, Mr. Lewis. Dumbledore interrupted gently but firmly as Roger's rhetoric rose. What intrigues me is why your study group calls itself Dumbledore's Army, not why you practice spells. Huh? Just that? Roger lifted a brow as understanding dawned. Headmaster, I thought it was serious. You're the greatest wizard we know. Against Voldemort, you'll be our beacon and commander. We just wanted to answer the call early, show resolve, rally morale. He could see he'd touched the very thing that made Dumbledore uneasy. The conversation ended with little fuss, though under a firm suggestion from the headmaster that they change the name. Back in the common room, Roger proposed a new title, and it was greeted with unanimous cheers and a unanimous vote: Hogwarts Legacy. The name sounded grand and proper, carrying the pride of true heirs of Hogwarts. The members of Hogwarts Legacy lived up to it. Their grades climbed as if bewitched, their spellwork left their peers far behind. Even Neville, Ron, and Seamus, once shaky in charms, improved so dramatically that Professor Flitwick beamed and awarded each of them 2 house points. The sight rankled Draco Malfoy. He had started the first study club himself, and never thought to pick a name so flashy and attention-grabbing. He wanted to bang his head against a wall. Unwilling to concede, Draco rounded up Crabbe, Goyle, Theodore, and Pansy, and christened his group with a suitably grand title, Hogwarts Mysteries. The name hinted at Slytherin's legacy and carried the house's air of noble secrecy. Draco was pleased. But his satisfaction evaporated when a chance walk past the legacy's practice room left him stunned. Harry and Ron were executing first-year spells flawlessly. Some spells Draco was still stumbling over. How could he bear that? Pale and furious, he ground his teeth and set himself to train twice as hard. The rivalry pushed Hogwarts' study atmosphere to new heights. The professors noticed and couldn't hide their smiles. Time flew, and the tense exam week arrived. When the results went up, Roger and Hermione took the top 2 places without surprise. Even so, jaws dropped when Draco Malfoy had vaulted into 3rd, with Harry and Ron at 4th and 5th. George, Fred, and Percy clustered around Ron. They had never imagined their slacker brother cracking the year's top 5, especially in first year. Studying makes me happy, doesn't it? Ron winked smugly at them. After exams came the highlight of the year, the end-of-term feast. For Roger, the food was nothing special, but for most of the students, this was the most thrilling moment. The House Cup would be awarded. At the feast, the final house standings would be revealed, deciding the castle's colors and decorations for the coming year. Every house's honor was at stake. Harry and Ron clenched their fists. Draco sat bolt upright. Even Professor Snape straightened, eyes sharp. As everyone expected, Dumbledore made a personal adjustment. Citing the Philosopher's Stone affair, he awarded extravagant points, 50 and 80 here and there, for courage and selflessness, rocketing Gryffindor from last to first. Roger, the true mainstay of that escapade, received far fewer points. Privately, Dumbledore explained, as much to soothe as to instruct, that too much praise too young could mislead a student. Roger inwardly chuckled. The logic sounded a lot like a boss saying, "Don't think about the money, youngster." Most students left the castle for home the next day. But at the feast's end, Dumbledore announced something new. The 5 top-scoring first years would represent Hogwarts for a special week-long summer stay at Nicholas Flamel's manor. Harry had originally been chosen, but the headmaster refused to let him leave the relative safety of his aunt's home, so the 6th-place student, Wayne, took his spot. After sending the youngsters off through the flu network, Dumbledore returned to his quiet office. He had barely settled into the high-backed chair when a sleek, mechanical bird, cold, metallic, appeared out of thin air and drifted down like a feather onto his desk. Dumbledore showed no surprise. The device came from his old friend, the legendary alchemist Nicholas Flamel. While many wizards still relied on owls, Nicholas had long since perfected an alchemical substitute. At first glance, the tiny bird seemed unremarkable, but it possessed astonishing apparition-like range. In an instant, it could cross mountains and sea, far outclassing any owl. Of course, such exquisite, potent craft would cost a fortune, something only someone who owned the Philosopher's Stone and regarded gold as pocket change could afford. Rumor had spread in recent months that Nicholas intended to destroy the stone and end his immortality. Was that why he now treated alchemical creations as disposable? Dumbledore regarded the silent bird with interest, wondering what news Nicholas would bring. "Help me!" A voice erupted from the bird's metal beak, hoarse, aged, desperate, shredding the quiet of the headmaster's office. The gentleness fled Dumbledore's face. His wise blue eyes went sharp as a hawk's. "Britain, Devon." A swirl of soot filled the air as Roger followed Professor McGonagall out of the fireplace. He stopped short. Before him rose an archetypal French chateau, opulent, exquisite, breathtaking. Nicolas Flamel's name flickered through his mind. The legendary alchemist had once lived in Paris. In 1990, he'd suddenly moved to Devon and built a manor to rival his old Parisian residence, apparently intending to settle here. Soon afterward, he had entrusted the Philosopher's Stone to Dumbledore for safekeeping. To Roger, however, the stone itself was less important than what it represented, a gate to an immense flow of magic. Close off the flow, and the stone was nothing more than an ordinary lump of rock. There was no crooked hag by the hearth, no pustule-covered dark wizard, no bizarre magical beasts. Instead, a dozen attendants stood perfectly still, impeccably dressed, fastidiously groomed, carrying the air of old French nobility. At their head stood a young woman, straight-backed and composed. Her raven hair lay without a stray lock. Her hazel-green eyes were as steady as a frozen lake. An elegant gown accentuated her poised, efficient bearing. Her politeness felt cool, distant, as if the identity of her guests made no difference to her. Roger's eyebrow twitched. In the biocomputer's view, the girl's magical pattern was not static at all, but shifting and flowing like living water. Alarm bells rang in his head. A person's magical pattern could change. He swept his gaze over the attendants, and the shock hit him again. Their patterns were viscous, almost solid. Their density surpassed even the dark aura Roger had once seen in Lord Voldemort. Nearly every one of them carried a miniature black hole of magic, reserved second only to the Philosopher's Stone he had seen at Hogwarts, attendants of Master Lemay, each with Voldemort-level power. "I am Vivian Shafiq," the young woman said, voice courteous but cool. "Master Lemay is indisposed today. I am here to receive you." She smiled correctly, though it lacked warmth. "Thank you, Miss Shafiq," McGonagall replied evenly, a flicker of surprise crossing her face. She recognized the name. This was the daughter of Joel Shafiq, the famed steward. That their host had not even sent his chief steward, but the steward's daughter, was a small breach of etiquette. She said nothing more and led the little wizards outside. The view beyond the door was staggering. The buildings were separated by vast distances. It felt like standing in open countryside. There was no spatial extension spell, just genuinely expansive land. Even Draco Malfoy, who usually held his nose high, clicked his tongue in astonishment. Malfoy Manor had its splendor, but only a couple of house elves. He had never seen such a parade of well-dressed human servants. In earlier times, pureblood families had shown status with house elves. Nowadays, with humans considered precious, only dark wizards routinely enslaved muggles and other wizards without restraint. The other students looked around in excitement, but Vivian strode straight for a nearby carriage, barely waiting for McGonagall's formalities to finish. McGonagall frowned subtly but maintained her composure, ushering the students after her. As they approached, Roger noticed something odd. There were no horses, and in the biocomputer's sight, there was no invisible team either. The carriage itself, however, radiated densely woven lines of magic, an alchemical masterpiece. Even he had to admire the craftsmanship inwardly. "Ladies and gentlemen, please board," McGonagall said, hiding her own admiration as she shepherded the students inside. The 5 little wizards had brought a fair amount of luggage. Ron even carried his pet rat Scabbers in a special cage. It was enough to fill a carriage on its own. "To welcome you, Master Lemay asked me to show you around the estate," Vivian said as she sat opposite them, her practiced smile unmoved. The carriage did not head for the main house. It glided across the open grounds, a silent display of boundless wealth. While everyone gaped at the luxury, Roger's memory snapped back to the boat ride across the Black Lake at Hogwarts. Dumbledore had said that voyage was more than transport. It was a ritual enabling the Sorting Hat to sense each new student's soul aura. Roger quietly reactivated the biocomputer's vision. The instant they took their seats, the carriage's interior seemed to come alive. Countless fine strands of magic reached out, gently wrapping and linking to every passenger. Shh, Roger hissed inwardly. It was ritual magic. He glanced at Vivian. Her polite, distant smile never flickered. Looking out, he saw the sweeping grasslands. Under the biocomputer's view, they were thick with magical lines, and from above, the pattern resembled the very shape of the Black Lake. None of the others noticed. "Professor McGonagall," Roger ventured softly, "have you been here before?" "Yes," she answered with a reminiscent smile. "With Professor Dumbledore. But that time we went straight to the main house. We never had the chance to admire this part of the estate." Her words set Roger's alarms screaming. He could object. What if the ritual was harmful? What if Master LeMay had other intentions? But he could voice no complaint without revealing suspicion. As a precaution, Roger slipped a finger inside his sleeve and cast his improved levitation charm, privately dubbed the Soaring Spell. The spell allowed him to fly, though the caster had to guide the movement with his own magic. It took effect subtly. Though he appeared seated, he hovered a hair's breadth above the cushion, an almost invisible gap between boot sole and seat. In the biocomputer's view, the strands that sought to coil around him snapped back when they failed to touch his body. Across the lawns, the carriage finally neared the outline of the main house. When it stopped before the doors, everyone from Hogwarts fell unconscious in an instant. Silent attendants stepped forward and began carrying the comatose group inside. Roger kept his eyes shut, feigning the same stupor, and let himself be borne along. Through slitted lids, he saw Professor McGonagall taken to a separate chamber, while he and the other students were conveyed elsewhere. Only when the footsteps had faded did Roger cautiously open his eyes. Their wands were gone. Office of the Minister for Magic Cornelius Fudge felt wretched, as if a wad of sticky cauldron scum had congealed around his heart. The confidential report on his desk might as well have been a hot brand. Dumbledore, that old busybody, had formed a student army called Dumbledore's Army at Hogwarts. What was he up to? Crown himself a third Dark Lord? Humph, Fudge snorted. The idea wasn't far-fetched. Look at Dumbledore's past. Grindelwald had been his bosom friend in his youth. Voldemort had been his star pupil. If anyone could put on a Dark Lord's mantle, it was him. In a way, Fudge almost hoped Dumbledore did want the title. Otherwise, why secretly drill an army of students? Planning a coup to overthrow the ministry? His restless gaze fell on another document, an application to confer an Order of Merlin on Roger Lewis, and his face went darker than cauldron rot. Behind the application loomed the latest wave of adoration for Dumbledore. Fudge could hear tomorrow's headlines now. Dumbledore, the eternal beacon of the magical world. A new star shines. Roger Lewis, Dumbledore's discerning discovery. Why does Hogwarts produce geniuses? Decoding Dumbledore's legendary education. The mentor leading a new era. Dumbledore's extraordinary influence. And worst of all, Headmaster Dumbledore. A soft pop of light, and Fudge's heart nearly stopped. Dumbledore had apparated into the office. Before, when the headmaster had simply stepped in like that, Fudge had chalked it up to the prerogatives of the powerful. Now cold sweat soaked his back. The man could kill him in an instant. "Minister Fudge, this is urgent." Dumbledore's face was graver than Fudge had ever seen. Even perfunctory greetings were omitted. Fudge read the request and felt his features pucker like a bitter gourd. Dumbledore wanted the ministry to open a flue connection directly to Nicholas LeMay's private hearth. Impossible. The ministry managed the flue network, but that didn't mean it could demand access into private homes, especially not that of Nicholas LeMay, the centuries-old alchemist and titan of philanthropy whose prestige was terrifying. Even without counting reputation, LeMay's personal power was likely unfathomable. The ministry had no appetite for tangling with him. Worse, LeMay was French, a resident in Britain. This could spark a diplomatic uproar. To Fudge, it would be political suicide. No, Dumbledore, absolutely not. For once, Fudge summoned ministerial steel and refused outright. "Cornelius, we must go," Dumbledore said. calm but leaving no room for argument. Fudge swallowed and parried. It would cause a serious diplomatic incident. On the contrary, Cornelius, Dumbledore interrupted, Master LeMay is in danger. If something happens to him on British soil, that will be the real diplomatic disaster. The French Ministry of Magic will not let it rest. Danger? Fudge yowled like a cat trodden on. Britain is perfectly safe. Since last year, dark wizard crime has been at an all-time low. I can't imagine what danger Master LeMay could possibly be in. In any case, the Ministry's flu network must not be abused. LeMay sent me a distress signal. Dumbledore's voice rose. He must be in a peril he cannot handle. Ha! Fudge leapt up, palms slamming the desk, face flushed, voice on the edge of hysteria. You mean the great Master LeMay asked you for help instead of the proper British Ministry of Magic? And now you stride in here, ordering me to grant you privileged access? Dumbledore, why don't you just take the minister's chair? Enough! Dumbledore's voice cracked like thunder. Silver light flashed from his wand tip and an unseen force struck Fudge's chest. The minister staggered back into his chair, white as parchment. From this moment, the ministry will bear the consequences of its choices. Before the words had fully faded, Dumbledore vanished, leaving Fudge slumped in the oversized ministerial chair, trembling uncontrollably. Nicholas LeMay Manor, main building, a certain room. Roger activated his biocomputer. Invisible scanning ripples spread across the chamber. Confirming it was safe, he turned to the unconscious Hermione, Ron, Wayne, and Draco. The situation was grave. Their sleep wasn't simple slumber. It had been rooted at the soul level. He remembered the anomaly on the carriage. Unseen filaments of ambient magic had linked their cores and injected something into them. The technique resembled a higher-order Imperio. By channeling the natural magic itself, it became nearly undetectable. That was the power of ritual magic. Anyone else might have been helpless against soul-level erosion, but Roger, long schooled in soul magic and armed with a soul scalpel, could manage it. The hitch was that his wand had been taken. He had to rely on wandless casting, which slashed both his strength and precision. He poured considerable energy into the work, sweating as he carefully stripped every foreign mote from the four cores. Ugh, where are we? That carriage makes you sleepy. Ron sat up, clutching his head, his voice thick with pain. Merlin, how did I fall asleep? How rude. Hermione, finding herself on a bed, assumed the manor staff had tucked her in and blushed deeply. Wayne looked about warily. Something's off. This doesn't feel right. Draco rubbed his temples and said, What could be wrong? The manor's huge and the carriage cushions were cloud-soft. Falling asleep is normal. Our wands, Roger said coldly, cutting to the point, have all been taken. The words hit like a bucket of ice water. The four young wizards snapped fully awake, faces paling. Wands were half a wizard's life. Without them, they were lions with their fangs pulled, almost helpless. There was an iron rule among witches and wizards: never touch another's wand without consent. And now 5 wands had vanished, certainly not a kindness. When Roger added that Professor McGonagall might be in danger, their anxiety crystallized into raw panic. What? What do we do? 4 pairs of eyes, strung by invisible threads, swung in unison, full of trust and fear, toward Roger. 47. The long-awaited resurrection, Nicholas LeMay Manor, basement of the main building. The air in the cellar was bone-chilling, carrying the musty tang of old stone and the sharp, lingering scent of potions. Candlelight trembled across rune-carved slabs and hanging instruments. Is everyone ready? Joel Shafiq's voice cut through the cold, steady and flat as stagnant water. His trademark wig shimmered oddly in the dimness. Yes, Father. They won't wake until the ritual is finished, Vivian replied softly. Her brows were tightly drawn. She seemed about to speak, then closed her mouth and swallowed the words. Finally. Joel's voice rose, an unnatural flush coloring his pale cheeks, his eyes bright with fanatical excitement. After tonight, Vivian, you'll see your mother again. She must miss you terribly. The Philosopher's Stone cannot grant that wish, Joel. The voice came weakly from the far corner of the room. Nicholas Flamel lay on a simple cot, gaunt, his hollow eyes heavy with sorrow. Undoing death, that is the deepest outrage against nature. Forcing such an outcome can only bring catastrophe. How will we know if we don't try? Joel snapped, the warmth draining from his face into cold, hard resolve. 30 years I've served you. All I asked was to borrow the stone to bring my beloved back. But you'd rather destroy it than give me a single chance." Flamel spoke with the weary patience of someone who had seen centuries pass. "No one should toy with life, Joel. It treats all things equally." "Those are strange words coming from a man who's lived over 600 years, Joel retorted, emotion resurfacing like a coiled spring. After a beat, he added more quietly, "Master Flamel, I've only given you a little anti-magic draught to keep you under. I only wish to borrow the Philosopher's Stone. Once you've recovered, take Vivian and leave. I don't want you both drawn into what comes next. You live trapped in the past, and because of that, Vivian has lain in sleep beside me for over 20 years, Flamel said without accusation, only sorrow. Your obsession has made her afraid even to speak her mother's name before you." Joel's gaze hardened. "Then I must try. I must see her again." Flamel sighed, as if pouring out the last of his strength. "Magic can reshape flesh and bone, Joel, but it cannot make a soul. It cannot call back a will that has been scattered like dust." His cloudy eyes drifted off, his voice thin. "My shell may yet be kept by the stone, but my soul has long since withered. My will is slipping away like sand. I have wanted to go for so long, you know this." Immortality was no blessing. Flamel had learned its poison. Joel cut him off with an urgent, furious whisper. "You don't understand the stone at all. You are kept alive because of it. My master will show you what it can truly do." "My master?" Flamel's body trembled as if at the very mention. Color drained from his ancient face until it was ashen. Silence fell. Then, without warning, a thick, inky black mist erupted in the center of the room. It swirled and condensed, coiling like living shadow, and a tall figure stepped out of it. Dark robes, a turban, and the narrow, cruel face of Professor Quirrell. Yet within those narrow eyes burned crimson pupils that cut like hellfire. The air chilled. "Well done, Joel," a voice hissed, slick as a snake on ice. Lord Voldemort's tone slid through the cellar with a hair-raising calm. "When I have fully returned, I will reward you. I will grant your wish." After fleeing Hogwarts, he had considered his options. The quickest path to restoration was still the Philosopher's Stone. Even if he could not seize it directly, the elixir of life could get him partway there. He had come for Flamel and the elixir, and Joel's betrayal had handed him an even greater prize. Months of careful planning had finally toppled the 600-year-old man. Voldemort intended to use the stone here and now to reconstruct his body and fully resurrect himself. He flicked his wand, the crimson gaze fixed on Flamel. "First, clear away this eyesore." "No, great master." Joel stepped forward with a bow that was both servile and immediate. "He is only a remnant, trapped in time. Do not waste your power on him. We have prisoners from Hogwarts. We must hurry before anything changes." A thin flare of displeasure passed through Voldemort's eyes. He disliked being contradicted, but he still needed Joel. With an affected wave, he withdrew his wand. "Very well." The word Hogwarts did, however, catch his attention. "People from Hogwarts?" he asked, voice low. "Roger Lewis, Hermione Granger, Ron Weasley." Joel began to list, but his words were cut short by a sharp, incredulous cry. "What?" Voldemort spun, crimson pupils blazing like hot iron, locking on Joel. "You said Roger Lewis?" "Yes, master," Joel said quickly. "He's detained with the other children." A cold laugh bubbled up from Voldemort, the sound brittle and horribly amused. Merlin's beard. What extraordinary fortune. Something dangerous and excited gleamed in those red eyes. Fate had kept tying him to that castle. He had failed to seize the stone at Hogwarts before. Now he stood at the threshold of success with Flamel, and yet members of that school had walked into his hand. If Dumbledore had set a trap, it was useless now. Minerva McGonagall was under their control, and several young wizards lay captive. No one could come from the Highlands in time to stop him. "Lead me to them," he said, sharp with impatience. "Bring them first. Things have just become much more interesting." 48. Clone Technique. The main house of Nicholas Flamel's manor was surprisingly large. An undetectable extension charm had been woven into the interior, so stepping inside felt like walking into an empty little town. Roger led a group of little wizards through it for a long time. At first everyone walked on tiptoe, but no matter how far they went, the corridors only seemed to stretch on and on. Not a single living soul appeared. It was as if they had broken into a deserted castle. Roger walked at the front, puzzling over the situation. In the original story, after Nicholas Flamel discovered the Philosopher's Stone was almost stolen, he destroyed the stone and quietly accepted his fate. Logically, he should have been the sort to host a harmless summer camp, or if not, simply refuse because of his friendship with Albus Dumbledore. Why go to such lengths to hide his house? Something had to have happened that Roger didn't know about. But what? He frowned deeply and had no answer. More urgent was the problem that the place was enormous. Finding an exit quickly mattered more than solving mysteries. I say, why don't we go out first? Draco's voice trembled. The unnatural silence set his nerves on edge. He felt like something terrible was hiding nearby. Oh, is young Master Malfoy frightened? Ron immediately took the chance to taunt. Who's frightened? Draco snapped, like a cat whose tail had been trodden on. To prove it, he yanked open a nearby door in a fit of pique. Ah! He leaped back, nearly knocking Hermione and Wayne over. Inside the room, several figures stood perfectly still. After a long moment, they still didn't move or blink. Roger edged closer and examined them. They were there, but as lifeless as wax statues. Hiss! He inhaled sharply. In Fairy, had Master LeMay sent them? But these didn't look like the dead. Their complexions were normal, and their clothes immaculate, none of the gray, decaying pallor of corpses. There are rumors in France that Master LeMay made a lot of alchemical life forms, Wayne said, frowning. You mean they aren't real people? Hermione's eyes widened. But they look so real. Draco suddenly remembered the attendants who had met them when they first arrived. Those dozen or so who greeted us this morning, could they be like this too? Everyone started to think the same thing. These 5 figures wore attendant uniforms and were dressed with identical meticulousness. Roger switched the biocomputer to observation mode. Through its overlay, the attendants in these 5 figures were traced by lines of magic, but the pattern was different from a living person's. The structure resembled a highly precise alchemical design. The energy lines running through them were dimmer and thinner, as if their power was nearly spent. Roger stepped forward, checking the edge of one of the wigs. Hidden beneath the hair, a small patch of skin had a cold, metallic sheen. Alchemical puppets. They were puppets. The little wizards crowded around, touching and studying them with exclamations of wonder. Creating lifelike puppets required not only top-tier alchemy, but also enormous amounts of rare materials. Thinking of how many such puppets might be hidden in the manor was dizzying. For Nicholas Flamel, the man who once possessed the Philosopher's Stone and could turn stone to gold, that kind of expense was probably trivial. Legends about his wealth still drifted through the Muggle world. Roger wasn't interested in Flamel's fortune. He wanted the alchemical knowledge. He began to study the puppets on the spot, fingers brushing cold surfaces, tracing the intricate circuits of ancient runes carved into their frames. The mechanism mimicked the human body as a vessel. Once imbued with magic, it could execute commands and simulate human behavior. Those people this morning were really those kinds of puppets? Ron murmured, circling one. Do you think could you make one that looks exactly like us? Draco crossed his arms, eyes gleaming. Ha! If I could bring one back, it'd make a great Quidditch practice partner. I'd finally beat Harry next year. He'd shifted from old prejudices to a more direct competitiveness. Hearing Harry had been allowed onto the Gryffindor team, Draco nagged Professor Snape until he got onto the Slytherin squad. If Roger's grades were top-notch, Draco didn't want to be outdone. Malfoy, you can't even beat Harry in a real match, and you think you'll win practicing with that junk? Why not just practice with Harry? Ron shot back. Are you worried you'll lose every time? Their banter drifted into the background as a bolt of realization struck Roger. Of course, he'd thought about using the Philosopher's Stone's infinite energy to create a clone, but he hadn't solved the body problem. These alchemical puppets were perfect shells, ready-made vessels. Plant a virtual soul inside, transfigure it into his own likeness, and he'd have a powerful clone. He couldn't let such experimental materials slip away, and this could even be their ticket out. If something went wrong, he could send the clone out as a decoy while he stayed hidden, observing and intervening as necessary. Roger took a small vial from his pocket, diluted magic sensing potion. Since the stone incident, he always carried 3 tiny bottles for emergencies. He drank, and the familiar current of energy washed over him. Concentrating, he began the delicate work of installing a virtual soul into one of the puppets. Meanwhile, in the lavish guest room where they had been held, Lord Voldemort stared at empty space, his voice cold as an ice vault. "Joel, where are the children?" Joel's face drained of color. Sweat trickled down his temple. He had never imagined someone subjected to the comatose ritual could wake up on their own. The ritual was a soul-level forced sleep. Without a release, it was supposed to be impossible to wake from. They had left no guard, believing the spell unbreakable. Now the entire roomful of little wizards had vanished. Voldemort's expression hardened. He knew the type of person who could crack such ancient magic. There was only one likely suspect: Roger. He had tangled with that boy for a year and knew his background. The kid's perception of magic was unnervingly sharp. He learned spells as if copying homework. Others might reach adulthood before inventing new magic, but Roger was almost entirely self-taught. Voldemort was certain Roger had discovered something and used it to slip away. "Master!" Joel's voice cracked. Panic made him reckless. I'll activate every alchemical puppet in the manor now. They don't fear a wizard's spells. Those brats don't have wands. I can catch them one by one." He thumped his chest to show determination. Voldemort's cold gaze swept over him. He turned to leave with Vivian, then dropped a whisper that chilled Joel to the bone. "I'll wait for you in the basement. Don't make me wait long, or your daughter will be punished in your place." A dangerous light flashed in Joel's eyes. Outside the manor, "Professor Dumbledore, are you certain?" Rufus Scrimgeour, head of the Auror office, narrowed his eyes as he studied the manor, tranquil, magnificent in the sunlight, and betraying no sign of intrusion. Everything around it looked orderly. Dumbledore had just been rebuffed by Cornelius Fudge, then stonewalled by the Flu Network Authority. The director there was a die-hard Fudge loyalist. After that, he had run into Scrimgeour. Scrimgeour was a hard, sharp man, the sort who had spent his life hunting dark wizards and took any hint of dark arts peril seriously. He and Fudge were not of one mind. He had his own ambitions. His suggestion to bring an elite Auror squad was as much a test of cooperation as an offer of help. "I am absolutely certain, Rufus." Dumbledore's brow was drawn as he looked toward the manor. "I have known Nicholas Flamel for over 100 years. We are close friends. With his strength, there are very few who could subdue him silently. For him to send a distress signal, he must be in grave danger." Scrimgeour said nothing. He knew he was on a different plane from men like Dumbledore or LeMay in terms of influence and raw power. "Then do we assault?" he asked quietly, his hand already on his wand. "A direct assault will fail." Dumbledore shook his head slowly, his sharp eyes sweeping the manor's invisible protections. "The ancient wards here are exceedingly strong. Nicholas once told me their secrets. I will need some time to break them." Inside the manor, Joel activated the manor's alchemical puppet system. At once, the statues that had stood like exquisite sculptures around the great hall lit with a faint inner glow. Their eyes brightened, their metal joints clicked, and the puppets moved as if waking to life. The little wizards who had been gathered around the 5 core puppets, studying them, were caught off guard and seized. Ron and Hermione tried to fight back, but the metal creations were terrifyingly strong. A single puppet was enough to pin one of them. Only Roger escaped immediate capture. He had already used his biocomputer to take covert control of a puppet. While the others were being marched away, he had deliberately dropped to the back of the line. He transfigured the puppet into his own likeness, shrank himself to the size of a ladybird, and hid in the sleeve of the false Roger. Brought before Professor Quirrell, the students reacted differently. Ron and Hermione, who had noticed the faint outline on the back of their teacher's head and knew the truth, went white as paper, barely able to breathe. Wayne and Draco, ignorant of what lay behind Quirrell's eyes, were merely anxious. Draco even tried to stay composed, and bargaining began before sense. "Professor Quirrell, I know you're doing this for money. Name your price. My father, Lucius Malfoy." From his hiding place, Roger thought, with the way he's treating the Dark Lord like a kidnapper to haggle over ransom, if Voldemort knew he'd explode. He said it with a small, private scorn. Quirrell's face, really Voldemort's, went inky dark. A quick hex flicked from his hand, slammed Draco into the wall like a rag doll. He crumpled unconscious. The basement fell into heavy silence, punctuated only by breathing. Voldemort ignored the young Malfoy. He walked to the puppet that looked like Roger and cast a soul vision. The spell confirmed the soul inside belonged to Roger. For a moment he stared at the puppet with his red, snake-like eyes, thoughts racing behind them. At first he had wanted to devour the boy. Now he wanted to recruit him. "My dear little apprentice, we meet again," he hissed, the voice coated in a false intimacy that made the hairs on the back of Hermione's neck rise. He paced around the puppet with a predator's grace. "Do you remember the werewolf restoration charm I taught you? Aha, if a werewolf can be restored, then other human-based transfigurations must have their counterspells." He stopped and mocked the puppet with a smile that never reached his eyes. "I have found it, the human restoration charm. It undoes any transfiguration performed upon a human form. Ladybug, Raven, Cerberus, some other trick?" he continued, relishing the cruelty. "You understand what I mean. The disguises you pride yourself on, a simple human restoration charm, and they vanish." He laughed then, bright, piercing, a little mad, until the memory of his failed resurrection at Roger's hands made that laughter die. With an elegant, deliberate movement, he drew his wand and aimed it at Roger. The four children standing there, Roger inside that puppet, Hermione, Ron, and Wayne, felt their throats tighten with fear. Voldemort's eyes gleamed with a cat-and-mouse contempt. "That spell you used last time, it was very special," he breathed, voice low and cautious. "Very potent. It could even withstand my magic. However," his tone turned cold, malignant, "I suspect you cannot use it many times, can you?" He stepped behind the puppet and slammed a cold palm down on its shoulder, leaning in to hiss, "You won't run now. I know you're clever." Roger said nothing. Voldemort fell silent and turned away toward a low platform set in the center of the room, an ancient teleportation array, its surface carved with complex runes. Joel barked a command. The alchemical puppets roughly shoved the Roger puppet onto the platform. A searing flash of light, and the figures on the runic circle were gone. "No, Roger!" Hermione's cry cut the basement like a blade. A few automatons remained motionless. Hermione stood pale and shaking. Ron trembled beside her. Wayne looked dazed, and Draco lay unconscious in a corner. "Lord Voldemort took him," Hermione said, her voice small and ragged. "It must be dangerous there. What do we do?" Ron stuttered, pointing weakly at the puppet guards. "They don't talk. Hermione looked at him as if he were hopeless. At that moment, a voice came from the doorway, a voice so old it sounded like dust and centuries, soft and strange and somehow comforting. "Children, there is no need to fear." They all turned toward the door. Vivian supported an unimaginably old man as he stepped slowly into the basement. He moved carefully, every breath measured. The students stared at him, breath caught. It was Nicholas Flamel. 50. "I refuse." The moment he stepped through the teleportation array, Roger saw the Philosopher's Stone for real. It didn't feel like a normal spatial jump so much as space being folded in on itself, like an undetectable extension charm, only governed by a deeper principle. The stone hung in that folded space, suspended and wavering like a shadow caught between worlds. "Is this a spatial rift?" he murmured. His pupils tightened, and he activated the biocomputer's visual scan, but the readout offered nothing. No magical patterns, no ley lines, only a void. It looked as if the stone belonged to the same category as ghosts. Voldemort, unsurprised, had apparently learned many of the stone's secrets from Joel. He sauntered in front of Roger as if enjoying the moment, testing him. "Want to know what this is? Some kind of residual will?" Roger guessed. He wasn't sure, but the thought occurred to him. Voldemort's expression shifted into genuine, grudging admiration. "My dear student, your talent is remarkable." Then the old arrogance returned, but not precise enough. Roger raised an eyebrow and waited. Voldemort had the look of a man who loved being listened to by someone bright. He spoke slowly, laying out his theory. "You could call it residual will, but more fundamentally, it is magic itself, twisted and solidified by an extreme will." "An obscurus," Roger offered. Voldemort allowed himself a small, pleased smile, then shook his head. "Sharp thinking, and close, but no. The soul is the bridge between the material world and the vast dimension of magic. When life ends and that bridge collapses, a torrent of magic pours through the breach into our world. The Philosopher's Stone forces such a channel into being and stabilizes it, turning that torrent into an inexhaustible source of magic. He went on, cold and sure. Nicholas Flamel had not published his method, but the clues were enough. Only places of vast, concentrated death could tear open a relatively stable rift. Mass graves, ancient battlefields, pits of countless corpses. Those sites spawn resentful spirits, ghosts, even sprites because they have been warped by that pouring magic. And to keep a rift from closing requires a terrible price, continuous soul energy as fuel. Following Voldemort's gesture, Roger looked down and saw a churning pool of blood beneath the suspended stone. The liquid pulsed with malignant magical fluctuations. It was undoubtedly soul blood. The pool seemed to turn soul blood back into souls, an alchemical inversion of death. Forbidden knowledge brushed Roger's mind like a dark draught. New experimental directions and possibilities flooded in. Thoughts came too fast, raw and brilliant. Voldemort did not miss a chance to sneer at Flamel. "Nicholas Flamel, he has a great deal of blood on his hands," he said flatly. There was an almost imperceptible thread of jealousy in his voice. Joel, who had watched Voldemort's exposition in rapt awe, could not help speaking up in Flamel's defense. "Master, when Flamel lived in the 14th century, the Black Death swept through Europe. It killed nearly half the population over 100 years. He did not actively cause that death. Death was everywhere, in Paris and across the continent." The comment hit Voldemort like a slap. His face went dark, his gaze fixed on Joel like an ice pick before shifting to Roger. He cut to the point. "Roger, I can choose not to devour you. Come with me, and you will be my second in command. My followers will swear fealty to you." Joel stared, dumbfounded. Voldemort treating a child as an equal, someone so proud submitting to another? It was unthinkable. Voldemort continued, sweeping his hands as if painting a future. "Look around the wizarding world. Most wizards have lost their way. They cling to the old, timid, and stagnant. Our greatest alchemical marvel is still a 1,000-year-old relic, while on the other side there are countless creations. That is the future I have seen. And the rest of the wizarding world? They are walking toward madness, wasting time on jinxes. Our civilization isn't just failing to progress, it's accelerating toward decay. Meanwhile, Muggle technology leaps ahead, producing wonders that rival magic. If this continues, the wizarding world will disintegrate and wizards will disappear." Roger found himself agreeing with much of what Voldemort said. If wizards did not adapt, their world could indeed collapse. As Muggle society became more advanced and convenient, Muggle-born and half-blood wizards might choose to integrate and never return to the old ways. With the internet and modern life, the gap between isolated wizarding lifestyles and Muggle convenience could become a chasm. No one likes to be left behind. Voldemort leaned closer, his voice promising. "You love studying magic. When I rule Britain, you will be headmaster of Hogwarts. You can explore any mystery and chase any unknown to your heart's content. A Philosopher's Stone like this should be used to create a glorious future for wizards." Joel's eyes flashed. He was almost entranced. Voldemort's rhetoric was slick, rational, and disturbingly persuasive. "I don't begrudge sharing power," he said. "Only a few are truly fit to wield authority. You should stand up, use your talents, and guide wizards to a bright future. Everything for the wizards. Everything for the future." This Voldemort was a refined manipulator. Having failed before and then regained himself, he sounded clear-headed, logical, and terrifyingly practical. Hardly the paranoid, fractured madman who'd split his soul into pieces. His approach was surgical. Intimidate with a display, dangle the soul knowledge bait, then present a grand blueprint. If someone inexperienced had heard it, they might have bowed in worship. Even ordinary people would feel moved. Roger's mind raced. Had his own arrival here already changed the course of events? Had some butterfly effect produced this more disciplined political Voldemort? Quirrell, under Voldemort's control, had heard the offer too. He felt his stomach drop. There had always been only one master. If Roger accepted, Quirrell would have another little master looming over him, an 11-year-old boy, no less. His face puckered like a bitter gourd. Envy, jealousy, resentment, malice. Every ugly feeling churned in him. Yet he had no right to speak against his lord's will. He told himself the resurrection would vindicate him. He had helped bring the master back. The resurrected Voldemort would be stronger than before, otherwise he would never have agreed to resurrect the dead. Someone so powerful was even willing to share rule with a first year from Hogwarts. If Roger nodded, Quirrell thought, he would be one of the most important men in Britain with almost no effort. Slowly, he forced himself to calm. Going from under one person to under two still left him above nearly everyone else. At least he would keep his contribution to the resurrection. Roger's answer was quiet, precise, and like an ice bullet into boiling oil. I refuse. 51. No one knows more about the resurrection than I do. To be honest, Lord Voldemort's offer had been tempting on the surface. For someone like him, so often seen as a lamb led to slaughter, to show such sincerity was rare. But Roger hadn't lost his head. This was Voldemort, the man who wanted to overturn the Ministry and set the wizarding world ablaze. What did that have to do with him? If he nodded, he would become an accomplice. And Voldemort succeeding? It wouldn't be simple. It would require his followers to bleed and die later on. The mild-sounding promises now were not his true thoughts. The Death Eaters and their networks hadn't been abolished. Voldemort was only polishing himself up, clinging to the empty title of adjutant while still being a Death Eater among Death Eaters. Such tricks didn't fool Roger. Even if Voldemort genuinely treated him as an equal rather than a subordinate, what would that mean? He'd merely become a leader in the wizarding world's foremost rebel organization, wanted, hunted, and risking everything. There was no practical benefit in Voldemort's terms, only pitfalls. To give up a bright future, an Order of Merlin at Hogwarts, to go rebel with him, to risk everything against Dumbledore and the Order of the Phoenix? Roger's answer was obvious. Voldemort's face darkened as Roger refused. Pride trampled in public stung him. He shot Roger a cold snort and then, as if to hide his wounded vanity, barked an order and fired a binding charm to tightly secure the Roger puppet. "Once I finish my resurrection, I'll come deal with you, ungrateful brat," he spat. "Joel, do it. Open the magic gate." Joel didn't move immediately. He stepped forward and pleaded insistently, "Master, please resurrect my wife." "I know." Voldemort's tone betrayed controlled impatience. "Once my power is fully restored, I will naturally fulfill your wish." Joel's determination didn't waver. "I beg you, do it now." Quirrell's eyes glittered with interest at the drama, like a student watching a thrilling play. Roger, too, was secretly surprised. Joel was extraordinary. He dared to contradict Voldemort more than once. "Are you questioning your master?" Voldemort's voice turned bone cold. Joel bowed his head and fell silent. Voldemort snorted. "There are no gods in this world. Even death is a construct of mortals. If there is any god at all, it is the indomitable will and immortal soul of a wizard." He walked to the edge of the churning pool of blood and looked up at the floating Philosopher's Stone. His voice cut through the mist with a chilling clarity. "You cannot imagine. The world beyond death I saw is also the world of the living." "Huh?" Joel's confusion echoed in the chamber, and Quirrell and Roger, both top students, shared that bafflement. "Master, are you saying the afterlife is actually the world of the living?" Joel asked, baffled. "It can be understood that way," Voldemort said, tall and proud. "But not entirely. When life fades, emotions, will, thought, the things that make us disintegrate and scatter, dispersing into every corner of the world. That is what the world after death is." Roger's voice came out abruptly. "Professor, is that true? How did you observe it?" Voldemort, who had been basking in his own superior knowledge of souls and resurrection, stiffened. No one knew more about resurrection, or believed they did, than he did. Roger's question struck like a needle. For a moment, a flash of offended color crossed Voldemort's face, then shame and anger rose in him. Whether useful or not, he lashed out. He raised his hand and fired a jinx at the Roger puppet. Roger dropped the puppet-controlled body to the ground and let out a few eerie wails to maintain the pretense. At the same time, he understood why Voldemort had reacted so violently. Roger's question had cut to the heart of Voldemort's secret. How could he have seen the afterlife unless he had died? The question stripped Voldemort bare and exposed a deep wound. Joel understood, too. He had no grand theory, but he grasped Voldemort's implication. If that was how Voldemort had obtained his knowledge, resurrecting Joel's wife might actually be possible. Voldemort's face grew serious. But to call back a soul gone long enough that its will has dispersed requires the direct power of the magical world and more than one resurrection ritual. Roger understood the implication. This was akin to necromancy, but Voldemort intended not just to raise bodies, but to reshape souls and wills, a far more difficult, dangerous art. He had laid out the price and the method. Joel was no fool. He had spent half his life pursuing ways to bring his wife back, had learned forbidden arts and resurrection secrets, and could weigh Voldemort's words. He bowed almost 90 degrees. "Master, forgive my disrespect." Then Joel drew his wand and began to chant a long, complex incantation. What astonished Roger most was that the chant had top-level secrecy charms on it. The biocomputer couldn't record a single bit. Even the sounds themselves vanished from his mind as if washed away. Nicholas Flamel had been bold indeed to entrust such an incantation to his butler. When the last syllable fell, the shadow floating in midair flared. It became a blazing sun, spraying out an overwhelming, purifying magic in all directions. Roger's heart leapt. The sensation matched what he had felt being forced to drink the magic-sensing potion by the old wizard, the onrush of consciousness into a torrent of pure magic. His biocomputer tried to pierce the light to see its core, and the image made his scalp prickle. Countless intricate magical patterns compressed, twisted, and layered into an infinitely small point. The sheer amount of information instantly overwhelmed the biocomputer. For the first time, it emitted an overload wail, and Roger ripped his view away. Quirrell and Joel fared worse. When their eyes brushed the edge of that ball of light, they clapped their hands over their faces as if burned, crying out in pain. "Fools," Voldemort mocked coldly. "That is the source of all mysteries, the starting point of the flow of time. How dare you try to peer into it?" Having failed once in resurrection, Voldemort was unusually composed now. He raised his wand with steady hands and began to channel that vast sea of magic into his shattered soul, guiding the torrent to pour in and formally begin the resurrection ritual. At the ritual's most critical moment, the entire underground space shook violently, like a giant beast rolling over. Every face in the chamber changed at once. Entrance to the basement, main building of the Nicolas Flamel Manor. A group of figures came rushing down the stairs. "Albus, you're finally here." A trace of a smile flickered across Nicholas Flamel's ancient face when he saw Dumbledore step through the doorway. Dumbledore did not hesitate. With a graceful flick of his wand, he intoned a spell, and the flagstone beneath the restless alchemical puppets scattered across the basement floor turned into a viscous mire, pinning them fast. "What's the situation?" His sharp eyes swept the room. "Principal. Professor Dumbledore." Hermione, Ron, Draco, and Wayne fell in around him, voices tumbling over one another as they hurriedly recounted how Roger had been seized and dragged away. "Well, it's all right. My longevity record is still intact," Flamel said with a weary attempt at levity. He was centuries old. A small joke came easier than panic. Dumbledore only shook his head, the smile gone. The reappearance of Lord Voldemort had darkened the air. "They forced me to drink a magic-suppressing draught," Flamel added, gripping Vivian's hand. His face was tired. "I'll need at least a day to recover. The rest is up to you. They're trying to resurrect Lord Voldemort." Rufus Scrimgeour and his Auror captain exchanged alarmed looks. To most of the wizarding world, Voldemort had been dead for 11 years. Whispers that he might live were dismissed as ghost stories. Coming from Nicholas Flamel, the news was explosive, enough to demand an immediate response from the Ministry. 2 Aurors helped a semi-conscious Professor McGonagall out of an adjoining room. Dumbledore checked her quickly. She had fallen into a deep magical sleep that resisted counter curses. His expression tightened. After a few futile attempts to rouse her, the Aurors escorted Flamel, Vivian, and McGonagall to a quieter chamber, while Dumbledore led Scrimgeour and the others toward the teleportation array deeper in the basement. Dumbledore recognized the array at once. It was the access point to the true hiding place of the Philosopher's Stone, a folded space he had helped design. The array could only be operated or locked from the inside, and it drew on the stone's nearly limitless magic as its power source. So long as the stone fed it, the barrier was virtually indestructible. Unless, Dumbledore thought, whatever ritual was underway inside was consuming enormous amounts of power. If that ritual drew enough of the stone's energy, the supply to the barrier could be weakened. A sufficiently violent external assault might force the array to burn through its reserves and break, and the strain of doing so could disrupt the ritual inside. Resurrecting Voldemort required an unimaginable torrent of magic. There was no time to hesitate. Dumbledore made his decision. Together with 5 or 6 Aurors, he raised his wand and unleashed a barrage of forceful spells at the teleportation array, hammering at it in the bluntest, most direct way they could. Inside the folded space, a nascent, snake-like face twisted. Voldemort's projection, only a suggestion of features so far, felt panic for the first time. The flow of magic that should have flooded this chamber from the Philosopher's Stone was thinning. His new body was barely sketched. The currents that should fill, shape, and bind him were ebbing. "Joel, what is going on?" he hissed, equal parts fury and fear. If the ritual failed here, if the power supply failed, everything would be lost. Joel, pale, swept his wand through the air to sense the magical currents. The stone's power should have distributed evenly. Instead, the current was being siphoned, diverted toward a single point. He glanced toward the bound youth in the corner. "Roger, it's that brat," Joel roared. "He's stealing it." Roger would not wait to be destroyed. The opportunity to touch the source of the stone's magic had been a temptation too great. Somewhere his true self had become a ravenous sink, devouring the surging power and spawning one virtual soul after another. The Philosopher's Stone's energy was vast, but its instantaneous output was limited. Roger had effectively opened a floodgate, seizing the lion's share of the flow that should have been feeding Voldemort. "Stop him now," Voldemort snarled. Joel lashed out first with a vicious crucio at the bound figure. But the puppet was no ordinary vessel. There were more than a few virtual souls nested inside it. The curse hit like a pebble thrown into an endless sea. The body did not flinch. Joel continued anyway, unleashing 14 consecutive crucios, each more violent than the last, but the swarm of souls within absorbed them. "Don't waste soul curses. Try stupefy," Voldemort screamed, remembering their last encounter and how this boy seemed to understand soul magics. Joel's wand stuttered and then sent a cascade of different hexes. Stupefy, Opugno, Confringo, Rocket Spell, Incendio. A riot of colored light struck the puppet in a storm of explosions and force. The construct shuddered under the impact, but it remained animated, apparently full of energy and not yielding to pain. "Useless," Voldemort hissed, losing control. In a last desperate attempt, he diverted the ritual's shaping power into raw destructive force and hurled several powerful offensive spells straight at the bound form. This time, the assault tore through the puppet's exterior. The shell cracked away, flaked off, revealing beneath it a cold alchemical skeleton scored with old burn marks and pitted with flaws. For an instant, Voldemort thought victory, until he became aware, like a chill under the skin of the space, that the overall magic had thinned even more. The attack had not produced the wave of energy he expected to reclaim the ritual's supply. Instead, something else had happened. "A fake," he breathed, disbelieving. The puppet he had been attacking was nothing but an alchemical decoy. The real thief, Roger's true, insatiable self, was elsewhere, siphoning the stone's power. The projection of his resurrection, so close to completion, was being starved. Rage ripped through him. For the first time since the attempt began, Voldemort's snake-like pupils constricted with raw animal fury, and he emitted a shriek that shredded the silence of the folded space. "He's still here. Search every corner." With his resurrection rite ruined, Lord Voldemort had no thought of recruiting Roger, only a flooding regret. Why hadn't he killed the boy sooner? Having learned from the last attempt, Voldemort found Roger's ladybug shape quicker this time. "Roger," he snarled, a viper's hiss. A human-shaped restoration charm lanced out. The ladybug twisted, swelled, and snapped back into Roger. At that instant, the magic holding the folded space collapsed. Like a pricked bubble, the whole pocket imploded. The Philosopher's Stone's blinding glare, the cellar's chill stone, and every person were flung back into reality. Unleashed, the stone's enormous power surged through the walls like a solid tide. To wizards, the flare was a beacon in the night, visible for miles. Only now did Roger fully understand why Nicholas Flamel had hidden it so painstakingly in folded space, keeping most of the world ignorant of the stone. Murderous, Voldemort ignored Dumbledore and the others. He forced Quirrell's arm up until the wand pointed, fiend fire roaring forth, the air itself warping from its heat. Catch! Dumbledore glanced, saw Roger empty-handed, and tossed the recovered wand. Wand in hand, Roger watched the devouring wave of flame bear down. His eyes flashed. Now with the stone's limitless power, it was the perfect moment to test the duplication charm. The magic inside him seethed like a long-dormant volcano. In the next heartbeat, the cellar felt like a stone dropped into a lake. Hundreds of Rogers burst into being, filling the space. The duplicates had been conjured from gravel, grit, sofas, chairs, cheap materials, far weaker than alchemical puppets, but countless and cheap to sustain. More astonishing, their numbers kept climbing toward 1,000. Voldemort hesitated. These copies could cast spells. In perfect unison, hundreds of Rogers raised their wands and hundreds of voices barked, Reducto! Each duplicate's spell was weak, but the flood became a torrent. The massed magic slammed the fiend fire back, eroding it, pinning it in place. Voldemort saw the counter in an instant. Finite, his wand swept a silent wave across the cellar. At once, every Roger duplicate was erased like chalk from a board. The fiend fire vanished with them, leaving only scorched air. Roger, Voldemort's voice was ice from the abyss, every word venom-laced. You are impressive. Roger merely smiled, gave a courteous wizard's bow, and replied with mild amusement, Your praise honors me, dear professor. Your instruction, I shall remember. With a roar of fury, Voldemort seized Joel Shafiq, crack, and both vanished. That was Imperius Curse? An Auror whispered. Has to be. Nobody else wears that purple turban, came the reply. Who's the old man beside him? LeMay's steward, they say. Rufus Scrimgeour ignored the gossip. He had seen Quirrell and Joel. He had never seen Voldemort's true face. The whole affair looked like LeMay's butler conspiring with an outsider to steal the stone, perhaps hoping to resurrect Voldemort. That was leagues away from the Dark Lord himself being alive. Good enough for a report. Cornelius Fudge could hardly object, and Dumbledore would owe him a favor. Mission accomplished. Dumbledore read Scrimgeour at once. Rufus, send your men back to report. A dazzling success, rescuing the drugged Master LeMay. Cornelius may even pin an Order of Merlin on you. Scrimgeour nodded, dispatched 2 runners, then turned to the boy called Roger. He had heard this year's Order of Merlin nominations included the boy. At first he had sneered, suspecting Dumbledore of manufacturing a hero. After watching that battle, especially the impossible duplication charm, Scrimgeour, no spellmaster, knew the feat merited a medal. Roger's face remained grave. Professor, did you feel it? Voldemort seems almost sane again. Dumbledore had been stunned anew. Duplication charm? No ordinary transfiguration. This broke Gamp's first law. The conjured forms had cast spells. Another breakthrough worthy of the Order of Merlin. But hearing Roger's last sentence, Dumbledore understood the dread behind sane. It meant the Dark Lord's soul was healing. From the cool strategy and instant decisions Voldemort had just shown, he might now be more rational than when the killing curse rebounded on him years ago. Tom Riddle had once been cold, rational, disciplined, brilliant, and terrifying. Later, he had slid into arrogance, blindness, frenzy, even folly. Horcruxes, Roger murmured. They drove him mad, but they can also give his mind back. Dumbledore nodded, the weight of agreement heavy on his shoulders. By now, ministry teams and local wizards, drawn by the stone's flare, were flooding the site. Cornelius Fudge gaped at the shining stone and the ravaged cellar. Weak Nicholas Flamel and unconscious Professor McGonagall, shattered alchemical puppets, scorched walls, and pitted stone. Clearly, LeMay had suffered a terrible attack. Yet the politician's mind spun fast. The Aurors had arrived in time to rescue Master and students. That was the story. The Ministry, wise and swift, had foiled villains, Quirrell and Steward Joel, bent on stealing the stone, saving the legendary alchemist and visiting pupils. As for Dumbledore, he had rushed in on word of the danger, fighting alongside the brave Aurors. How he had heard was irrelevant, at least to Fudge, who knew the public would not pry. The embellishment was, loosely, true. Next morning, the Daily Prophet's front page blared news of the attack on Nicholas Flamel. The photo showed Minister Fudge beaming beside the rescued, a weary LeMay, a just-waking McGonagall, a shaken Ron Weasley clutching his rat. Dumbledore was absent. He had left on business, and Fudge preferred it that way. To soften the scandal, Fudge beamed at the camera and urged, "Smile, children. Especially you, red-haired lad. Hold your rat and look happy. 54. The Voice of Azkaban. Thanks to some brilliant public relations work by the Ministry of Magic, the fallout from the Nicholas Flamel robbery was minimized, and Minister Cornelius Fudge even managed to squeeze out a hefty dose of political capital. Rufus Scrimgeour's operation could no longer be labeled unauthorized. Overnight, it became a meticulously planned mission under the astute leadership of Minister Fudge. Far from being disciplined, Scrimgeour was lavishly rewarded by Fudge and hailed as the hero who cracked the case. As for Fudge himself, he was praised for his wise leadership and unshakable command. The stunt cemented his public image as a shrewd, capable minister who could keep the country safe. Inquiries from the International Confederation of Wizards and the French Ministry of Magic were handled easily. No one had been hurt, and nothing of real value had been lost. The Philosopher's Stone had never been missing, so a routine official notice sufficed. Fudge even toyed with staging a grand Nicholas Flamel, thanks the British Ministry of Magic, gala to bask in the limelight. Yet beneath the gaze of the legendary alchemist, those eyes that seemed to see straight through him, he never dared voice the thought, and the plan fizzled. All he could do was plaster the hastily taken group photo across the front page of the Daily Prophet for a full fortnight. The ordeal had left Nicholas Flamel visibly weaker. He was more determined than ever to destroy the Philosopher's Stone. Once that was done, he would return to Paris and quietly await the end of his life. Hogwarts summer camp wrapped up in haste, but before the students departed, the ailing old man gave each of them a gift. A delicate, alchemically crafted songbird, the very kind he had used to send a distress call to Dumbledore. Roger received an extra present, a thick alchemical notebook. The first half covered basic principles. The real treasure was the second half, Flamel's personal insights in his own hand. Roger's fingers trembled as he held the notebook. It felt like clutching the holy grail of alchemy. Merlin, these were the handwritten notes of the greatest alchemist in human history. What staggering secrets must lie in those pages? Thanks to Voldemort's patient tutelage, Roger had already taught himself ancient runes in his first year, including many of the Dark Lord's private findings. He could decipher the rune-heavy text with ease. Back at the burrow, Roger opened the notebook at once. Even a quick skim yielded huge gains. In antiquity, alchemy had been near common knowledge. Nearly every wizard knew the basics. Yet it was also an esoteric art because each practitioner recorded discoveries in private codes and metaphors. The sun's blaze, the moon's chill, a storm's frenzy. Later students were often left hopelessly confused. In modern times, the language of alchemy had become clearer and more standardized, but breakthroughs had grown rare. Reading the legend's notes, Roger found Flamel's style startlingly straightforward. Faced with a research dead end, the alchemist's usual solution was to throw colossal amounts of magical resources at it. If that route still wouldn't yield, he simply shifted to a path that could be forced open with resources, and kept hurling them. With Voldemort still a threat, and Roger lacking a family, Dumbledore arranged for him to spend the rest of the holidays at the Weasleys'. The Burrow lay in Devon, much closer to the campsite than London, one of Dumbledore's reasons for the choice. Arthur Weasley had acquired a second-hand Ford Anglia and enchanted it to fly. That day he piloted the beloved Sky Car to collect Ron and Roger. The car wobbled down onto the patch of ground in front of the house, where Molly Weasley bustled out to greet them. Thanks to his nomination for an Order of Merlin, Roger was now a minor celebrity, and Molly gave him a warm welcome. In her eyes, he was an exemplary student. Having Dumbledore place him under her roof was a delight. The burrow was larger than it looked. The crooked house itself had 6 floors, 7 if you counted the attic. A small courtyard lay in front. Behind stretched a big garden with a pond, and beyond that a hill planted with fruit trees, part of the Weasley property. In terms of space and comfort, it was a fine home, though, like Roger's inherited country villa. Its decor was plain, unpretentious, and decidedly no frills. Molly set the twins to hauling Roger's luggage upstairs, while Arthur carefully reversed the car outside. Ron's had a wonderful year, and made such splendid friends. Molly chattered as Arthur maneuvered, forgetting to guide him. He's bound to be the youngest ever recipient of an Order of Merlin. Hey, dear, Mind the rear, Arthur called in exasperation as the car clipped the hedge with a crunch. He parked, shut the engine off, and sighed. In a low voice, he said, I hate to spoil the mood, but it may not go smoothly. Cornelius Fudge has sent the Wiesengemot an official document questioning the academic validity of Roger's polymorphic transformation. The ministry and the Wiesengemot are at loggerheads over it. What? Molly's shriek nearly lifted the roof. Is that true? Absolutely, Arthur said gravely, motioning her to keep quiet. Step aside. I haven't finished parking. Heavens, how can they treat a child like this? She wailed. Arthur killed the engine and, shutting the car door, muttered, Fudge isn't after Roger. He's after Dumbledore. He's nitpicking everything to do with Hogwarts. It's obvious he's gunning for Albus. But why? Molly demanded, trailing him into the house. Who knows? Arthur answered, worry creasing his face. There are whispers. Fudge fears Dumbledore might take his post as minister. Has Cornelius Fudge lost his mind? Molly fumed. If Albus wanted to be minister, he'd have been ages ago. The man's paranoid. You're telling me, Arthur said wryly. These days, anything connected to Hogwarts gets frozen by Fudge. He hesitated, not voicing a darker suspicion, that Fudge was quietly purging ministry staff close to Dumbledore. Arthur himself clearly counted among them. Meanwhile, news of the attack on Nicholas Flamel rode the pages of the Daily Prophet out to the cold North Sea and the prison fortress of Azkaban. A bored ministry guard sat on the frigid shore outside the castle, gazing at the gray ocean while the salty wind whipped his hair and the newspaper in his hand. He finished the article with a scowl, muttering oaths about local dark wizards bold enough to rob Nicholas Flamel. Why hadn't Flamel been recalled? He knew how to handle them. He flung the paper onto a side table and slumped into a deck chair, eyes shut. This wretched place, nothing but dementors swirling in the air and half-dead prisoners. Boredom drove a man mad. A cold, damp gust swept the paper into the air like a clumsy gull. It fluttered through a dark window of Azkaban Castle. Deep inside the fortress, a hoarse, rasping voice burst forth, echoing off the icy stone in twisted ecstasy. He's at Hogwarts! I know it! He's at Hogwarts! 55. Ava's little death chained the burrow. Bill and Charlie Weasley had long since left home, Bill to work at Gringotts in Egypt, Charlie to study dragons in Romania, so only 7 Weasleys remained under the crooked roof. Mr. and Mrs. Weasley, Percy, Fred and George, Ron, and little Ginny. Molly had cheerfully installed Roger in Charlie's old 4th-floor room. Bill's room sat empty next door. The whole of the top floor was his. Out the back door, the garden ran wild. It was every gardener's nightmare, and every child's dream. Tangled flower beds, rampant weeds, and a lily-pad-choked pond where lazy frogs floated. The Weasleys' gardening philosophy might have been best described as laissez-faire. The plants could do as they pleased. The place had become a playground for every small creature that liked hedges and holes, including the family's perennial foes, the garden gnomes. Roger had spent a good deal of the last few weeks helping Ron, Fred, and George pull the pests out. Gnomes were infamous nuisances in the wizarding world, stupid, curious, and oddly persistent. Mention gnome clearing, and they would poke their knobby heads out of burrows like prairie dogs, inviting capture. The Weasley method was brutal in its simplicity. Grab one, swing it around until it went dizzy, then fling it high over the garden wall like a clumsy potato. Inevitably, the stubborn things homed back, and the tradition repeated every few days. Days at the burrow slipped by calmly and swiftly. For nearly a month, Roger buried himself in Nicholas Flamel's arcane alchemical notes, trying to make sense of the magical patterns he had glimpsed during the battle over the Philosopher's Stone. That fight had taught him how thin his arsenal really was. Against wizards at the top of their craft, Voldemort, Snape, even Dumbledore, his magic felt inadequate. Worse, Voldemort's discovery of an easy counterspell to transfiguration had neutered one of Roger's favorite approaches. He turned then to the Unforgivable Curses. Ancient wizards had chosen those 3 for a reason. Raw power, few counters, dependable results. But in the modern world, they were criminal, and they were not invincible. Centuries of experience had produced ways to blunt them. Lily Potter's protective charm, the one that rebounded on Voldemort, proved that no counterspell did not mean no defense. Roger reopened a battered book, Imperius Curse, The Killing Curse, Scalpels of the Soul, and read the chapter on Freya's use of the Cruciatus. Her school had reported that deliberately lowering Crucio's intensity increased both agony and lethality beyond that of the Killing Curse. They did not know why. Roger realized Freya had hit a precise node within the victim's soul. The soul, however, was not a single unit. Hitting that node was like spearing a single fish in an ocean. Possible, but extraordinarily unlikely. He came to that conclusion after a series of garden experiments on volunteer gnomes. Casting Crucio on different regions of a gnome's magical patterns and on blank parts of the creature showed him that the zone carrying patterns was far larger than the pattern itself. It supported his earlier theory. Pattern and soul were not one and the same. Think of the pattern as a building and the soul as its foundation. The building could only stand as high as the foundation allowed. He remembered the glimpse into the rift of the magical world, where a torrent of patterns had overwhelmed his biocomputer. Were those all souls? The source of this world's souls? Beings from another world? The Philosopher's Stone had been destroyed and the window had closed. But the link, once understood, suggested new ways to attack. First tactic, smash the foundation. Pour in so much meaningless pattern energy that the victim's soul could not support itself, an overload that shattered from the base up. Tests on gnomes were dramatic. Bodies remained intact, but minds were gone, brain dead. He called it the Great Killing Soul Curse. Human trials remained to be seen. Second, sever the joint where pattern met soul. Borrowing the Killing Curse's principle, an instant hammer blow to the soul, he concentrated the strike precisely at the pattern-soul junction. The green flash of the classic Avada Kedavra was easy to spot and dodge. A moon-white, tightly focused bolt aimed at that junction could be subtle, perfect for ambush. Controlled experiments on gnomes produced stupor, paralysis, or near-death states. He did not stop there. Once a curse became known, a prepared enemy could prepare a defense, so he wove in his own little flight charm and an obscure ricochet spell. The bolt could home faintly, and when it struck the junction, surplus energy would arc like chain lightning to nearby targets, forming in effect a killing curse chain. Much better, he thought. They refined the spell while the gnomes suffered and recovered and suffered again. One evening, Arthur Weasley finally finished a long overtime at the ministry and flew the enchanted Anglia home. Molly was at the gate the moment the car settled. She hustled out, beaming and fussing as usual. "Everything all right at home?" Arthur asked, easing down. "Couldn't be better," Molly said, taking his briefcase. "Roger's always reading, books day and night, and Fred, George, and Ron have fallen into it too. Guess what? All their holiday homework's done." "Splendid." Arthur smiled, then a shadow crossed his face. "But the ministry has been arguing for a month, and they've decided to open a formal inquiry into Roger's academic misconduct. A summons is on its way. Investigators may even come to Hogwarts." "Have those fools at the ministry gone completely mad?" Molly shrieked, brandishing her dish towel as if it were a cudgel. "All they do is meddle." "Easy, Molly," Arthur soothed. "Dumbledore will handle it. The facts will speak for themselves. By the way, what are the lads up to? Sounds lively from here." They walked toward the garden gate, and from beyond came Roger's voice carrying over the hedges, mixed with a faint crackle of magical energy. "Avada, mini killing curse chain." Molly laughed and shook her head. "They're fine. Playing at fighting you-know-who, I expect." 56. Modified flying car. The first floor of the burrow. "Hey boys, how's your summer break going?" Arthur called as Ron, Fred, George, and Roger trudged in from their skirmish in the garden. "It's just fantastic." Ron shrugged, his tone as wilted as a sun-scorched gnome. "While you're working overtime at the ministry, we're doing advanced studies at the Weasley Institute of Advanced Study. We're all incredibly fulfilled." He grumbled inwardly. He and Roger simply didn't click. Roger was always with his nose in books as thick as bricks or practicing spells Ron couldn't begin to understand while they were de-gnoming the garden. What made Ron the maddest was that Roger had absolutely no interest in Quidditch. For a die-hard Chudley Cannons fan, spending a whole month without talking about the sport, watching matches, or getting excited over scores, having to read and study with Roger instead, felt worse than detention. Roger bored him almost as much as Percy did, though at least Roger wasn't bossy and was helpful in the way that let Ron copy homework. He missed Harry terribly. Harry at least understood Quidditch. He'd written a dozen letters with nothing but silence in return. "Oh, Harry!" Arthur interrupted at Ron's muttered complaint. "I heard, from old bones at the office for the prohibition of the misuse of magic, that Harry may have received a warning letter for using magic outside school." "Dinner's ready, boys." Molly's voice called from the kitchen at just the right moment, cutting the conversation off. Roger had to admit the Weasley table was astonishingly generous. Arthur's salary went a long way in a large family, especially with children still at school. But the household's Gringotts vault was thin enough it might have held less than 2 galleons. Still, the Weasleys' enthusiasm for life and love for one another never diminished. Roger remembered the original story where Arthur had splurged the 700 galleon prize on a family trip to Egypt rather than pinching every nut away. They were the living embodiment of buy now, pay later in the wizarding world. No wonder Arthur liked tinkering with that old flying Ford Anglia himself. If magic didn't limit commodities and loans, who knew what other imaginative purchases he might have made? After dinner, Roger curled up in his usual corner with books on souls, transfiguration, and alchemy. Ron, on the other hand, couldn't sit still. He poked the twins. "We have to go see Harry. He must be in big trouble." "Roger, what do you think?" Ron asked, hopeful. Roger looked up from his pile. "Good idea, but how do we get there? Harry's in Surrey and we're in Devon. That's nearly 300 kilometers. How about Dad's flying car?" Fred's eyes flared. "Cool." George started rubbing his hands, already buzzing. Roger rolled his eyes inwardly. Well, this won't be my fault, but he thought the idea was poor. He remembered how in the original tale, picking up Harry took half the night, and the Ford's speed after Arthur's enchantments was hardly any faster than the Hogwarts Express. A Muggle car that could top 100 kilometers an hour had been made to match an antique steam train. That was to be expected. Arthur's modifications were practical rather than performance-oriented, made with spare materials and a tinker's approach. "Too slow," Roger said. Then, after a beat, he added, "How about we give it an upgrade?" That was all it took to set the twins off. The three of them were instantly in agreement. Late at night, after Mr. and Mrs. Weasley were asleep, the boys crept downstairs and out to the shed where the Ford Anglia sat. Ron normally had little interest in tinkering, but the thought of seeing Harry sooner pulled him along. The twins circled the car, nodded to one another, and led the others around behind the house into a rickety stone outbuilding, the broom shed, the family's junk room, and above all, the twins' treasure trove. They shoved aside piles of old newspapers and rusty cauldrons and dragged out heavy dust-coated crates from the furthest corner. Lifting the lids revealed a miniature magical black market. Gnome saliva, horklump mucus, clabbert fangs, imp eyeballs, bouncing bulbs, venomous tentacula venom sacs, shrivel fig juice. Fred rattled off the contents like a professional. "Merlin's beard." Ron's eyes almost popped. "You hid all of this?" "I come in here every day to put my broom away, and I never knew." George grinned. "Little kids shouldn't pry into grown-up business. Want to join in? If Mum finds out, you're in it too. Don't complain when you're being walloped." The warning word was like cold water on Ron's head. He ducked and waved his hands. "I didn't see anything. Carry on." He suddenly decided his twin brothers were very considerate indeed. Roger skimmed the materials. Most were common magical scraps. "Only the shrivel fig juice is interesting. It can slightly warp space," he said. Fred frowned. "It's a bit meager, but we've also got some mercury and a small piece of mithril in our room." Mithril? Roger was surprised. It wasn't the highest grade alchemical material, but it certainly wasn't cheap. "Saved up 2 years' pocket money, plus what we made from proxy buying last year, to buy this little piece," Fred said, his voice half proud, half pained. George dashed back upstairs like a gust and returned with a heavy lead box that insulated against magic. Their plan was blunt but clever. Use the mithril and mercury to etch new magical conduits into the car's body, mix the other materials as mediums, and then apply a string of practical enchantments: a breaking charm, a cushioning charm, an advanced concealment charm, a featherlight charm, and a sticking charm. They were working from a dog-eared copy of a simple guide to making magic objects. The book was basic, Principles were only sketched out, but the steps were meticulous, covering alchemy, potions, and creature materials. It was clear the twins, beneath their prankster surface, had studied hard to build things like the future stock of Weasley's wizard wheezes. "I don't think it's enough," Roger said seriously, setting the manual down. "This car has to carry people. It's not a toy." Their experience with joke items didn't amount to much for a project this big. Roger produced an exquisite alchemical bird, a high-end device with an apparition function, a gift from Nicholas Flamel. Then, fixing Ron with a steady look, he waited. Ron hesitated, then reluctantly took his own bird from his pocket and handed it over as if cutting out his own heart. "Here, take care when you dismantle it." The shed lit up through the night as they worked. The two precious alchemical birds were carefully taken apart and their core components integrated into the Ford. Roger etched ancient runes circuits precisely onto the metal frame. Spells were bound into the conduits, and magic flowed faintly along paths drawn with mithril. They expanded the interior space with clever enchantments, reworked controls and wards, and bolted on the twins' mixtures where they would be stabilizers and focus. When dawn broke, the modifications were complete. From the outside, the Ford still looked like Arthur's battered Anglia, but inside, and in the weave of its magic, it was transformed. The theoretical speed had been increased significantly, the interior was more spacious, and most astonishing of all, it could now perform short-range apparition. The four boys stared at the car like children at a newly hatched creature. Their eyes shone with impatient excitement. They wanted nothing more than to jump in and find out how fast it could fly. Downstairs at the burrow, the twins and Roger were in their element. After their little collaboration, Fred and George discovered that Roger was exactly their sort of person, brilliant with machines, just like them. They excitedly showed off the inventions they were working on, dung bombs and Tong toffee, and asked Roger what he thought. To their surprise, the three of them hit it off instantly. Roger didn't just critique. He casually tossed out idea after idea, many of them things that would one day sweep through Hogwarts. Fake wands, the skiving snack boxes line, puking pastilles, nosebleed nougat, fainting fancies, fever fudge, headless hats, canary creams, extendable ears, boxing telescopes, Weasley's wildfire whiz-bangs, even a portable swamp. At first, the twins smiled. The more Roger spoke, the wider their eyes grew, until they could hardly contain themselves. Everything he mentioned was on their secret wish list. They fished out their small notebooks and scribbled down notes with a concentration that put their history of magic classes to shame. Ron, by contrast, couldn't have cared less about jokes and gags. He had one thought: hurry up and get dark so they could use the car to fetch Harry from Privet Drive. Night finally fell. Arthur Weasley was on the 5th floor of the burrow when an owl from the Ministry of Magic thumped against his window. Arthur woke, bleary-eyed, and opened the sash. Seeing the ministry owl, sleep vanished. He tore open the letter and scanned it. His face went pale. He tumbled out of bed, threw on his clothes, grabbed his briefcase and a handful of flu powder. "Arthur, what's wrong?" Molly asked, alarm in her voice. "Something big. I'm needed at the ministry right away," Arthur said, urgency in every word. "Sirius Black's escaped from Azkaban. Fudge has already released the Dementors, and they're searching the whole country." "What?" Molly's scream nearly raised the rafters. "Dementors!" "Exactly," Arthur said grimly. "And after that Flamel business, Fudge has gone even more heavy-handed than usual. The Ministry's in chaos." He tossed the powder into the fireplace. "Ministry of Magic." The flames flared, swallowing him. Meanwhile, the flying Ford Anglia drifted toward number 4 Privet Drive. In the cramped attic, Harry, who hadn't been sent to summer camp, lay drowsy and hungry, not sure if he was asleep or awake. Roger recognized the barred attic window at once, just like in the books. He turned the car in close and tapped on the glass. "Harry! Harry! Wake up!" Ron rattled the window until Harry stumbled over and pushed at the sash. When he saw the turquoise Ford Anglia in the street and Roger in the driver's seat, his jaw dropped. Ron, Fred, and George were grinning in the back. Once they'd explained what had happened, with Ron's letters intercepted by Dobby, Ron shouted, "Pack up! Spend the rest of the summer at my house." There was a problem: the iron bars across the window and the rule that underage witches and wizards couldn't do magic outside school. For a moment they were stuck. Roger, however, simply drew his wand and flicked it. The bars snapped away and fell to the ground as if they weighed nothing. "Forgot to mention," Roger said with a grin to four stunned faces, "this wand of mine's registered to Dumbledore's old partner. The trace won't pick it up." He tapped his wand again. "Accio Harry's things." With a crash and a flurry, Harry's trunk and Nimbus 2000 tore themselves out of the locked cupboard and flew into the car's boot. The noise woke the Dursleys. Uncle Vernon burst up into the attic like an enraged bull. Seeing a flying car and four wizards, one with his wand out, he lunged and grabbed Harry's arm. "Use that thing, and you'll be expelled," he snorted triumphantly. "Technically, you're right," Roger said with a cold smile, "but that rule doesn't apply to me." He gave the wand a sharp tap. There was a blinding flash and a high, squealing noise. Uncle Vernon let out a sound like a stuck pig and was hurled out of the doorway, tumbling away in a heap like a sack of meat. "Get in the car," Roger ordered. Harry could scarcely believe it. He put his head out the window and let the cool night air wash over him as number 4 shrank behind them. He wanted to shout with relief. As the car rose and streaked back into the sky, he began pouring out everything that had happened. Denied summer camp, a house elf named Dobby appearing and warning him not to return to Hogwarts, Aunt Petunia's ruined pudding banquet, a severe letter from the ministry, and then being locked in the stifling attic like some criminal. He was hurt and angry and urgently in need of the comfort of his friends. Ron listened, unable to hide how pleased he was. Suddenly the housebound life of doing homework and reading didn't look so bad after all. Fred hugged himself and shivered. The car, though, was getting unnaturally cold. "Can we close the window? I'm freezing," Fred said. "Or fly a bit lower?" Roger frowned. "We haven't even gone that high." He shut the window, but the cold only intensified, cutting through their clothes. Then, without warning, the deep blue sky speckled with stars simply vanished. It wasn't cloud. It was as if someone had poured a bucket of black paint across the heavens. Moonlight, starlight, even the car's headlights were swallowed up. The world went utterly dark. "What's happening?" Ron shivered so hard he could hardly speak. It felt as if ice had been poured over him. His hair prickled. Roger's instincts kicked in. He engaged the car's biocomputer. Images and readings flickered through his mind, making his scalp tingle. On the display, cold, indistinct shapes seemed to condense out of the darkness and begin to circle the car, moving like living things. What the hell are they?" Roger's voice was taut. A terrible memory seized him, bringing with it that familiar, soul-deep chill. Dementors. Chapter 58, Returning to the Humble Abode. What on earth was that thing? Harry, Ron, and even the usually fearless twins felt a bone-deep cold settle over the flying car. They pressed their faces to the windows, straining into the thick, impenetrable darkness outside, but could see nothing. In Roger's biocomputer vision, however, everything was starkly clear. The three dark shapes pursuing them carried magical patterns. They were magical creatures, though as ethereal as ghosts. Strangely, their patterns were fragmented, as if their souls were incomplete or had been torn apart. Roger studied them hard, but could make no sense of it. When the figures finally came into view with the naked eye, all 5 boys gasped. 3 monsters, each nearly 3 meters tall, loomed in tattered black cloaks. Their skin was a grayish-white, bloated and corpse-like, like rotting giants dragged up from the deep. A bone-chilling, ear-piercing shriek split the air. They lunged at the flying car. "Roger, speed up! Get away!" Even a fool could see what they were facing now. "I know." Roger had been watching those things for some time. The car wasn't slow, but the shadows clung to the rear like a curse. Roger's heart sank. How could Dementors be moving like this? It was as if they were racing at over 100 kilometers an hour. "Are these Dementors mad? Why would they be out here?" Fred's voice shook. "Something big must have happened at Azkaban," George said, face hard. The worst-case scenario hung in the air. Roger slammed the accelerator. The engine screamed as the car shot forward like an arrow. But the Dementors didn't fall behind. Their rotting cloaks seemed to grow across the windows, their icy presence pressing against the glass. Ron's voice broke with panic. "What do we do now?" Ron's mind conjured absurd images, his mother chasing him with a feather duster, while Harry did far worse. He curled in on himself, face as pale as paper, forehead pressed to the cold window. "I hear Voldemort killing my mother," he whispered, as if the memory were being dragged from him by a cold hook. His consciousness slipped toward the nightmare the Dementors forced him to relive. Fred and George, older and steadier, still trembled so their teeth chattered. Roger felt as if he were sinking into freezing sludge. Every breath was a struggle. Fighting the chill that threatened to freeze his soul, he scanned the surroundings through his biocomputer vision. What he saw made his hair stand on end. The flying car was wrapped in an abnormal, shattered web of magical threads, twisted and chaotic. According to the old wizard theory of ley line magic, magical traces are fluid and holistic. They should never be fractured like this. Something powerful had warped the magic in the area. Their car wasn't flying the way it should. It was trapped, circling inside a warped space. He couldn't hesitate. Roger made a split-second decision and activated the still untested apparition function. The device had been jury-rigged from parts of 2 alchemical birds. Whether it could teleport 5 people was unknown, but it was life or death. He tapped his wand against an inconspicuous rune on the console. The car emitted a piercing buzz, the chassis vibrated, the engine roaring like an overburdened beast. Just as he feared the modification had failed, pop! With a loud bang, the flying car and its 5 passengers vanished from their position. The scenery blurred and refocused. A deep blue night overhead, the Milky Way visible. For a moment they thought they'd made it. Then Ron screamed and pointed behind them. They're still there! The gray, terrifying figures had materialized in the nearby night sky. The apparition distance had been far too short. The Dementors opened those invisible, gaping mouths again, and the dark, light-eating shroud began to unfurl. "Hold on tight," Roger roared, pouring the last of his magic into the car's control core and triggering the dangerous teleportation again. Pop, pop, pop! Several frantic, short-distance flashes. Each jump came with the engine's heart-wrenching wail and a sickening sensation of the world spinning inside the cabin. At last, when the light from the final teleport faded, the all-consuming darkness and the 3 life-stealing shadows were gone. Silence fell. Only the heavy breathing of the survivors filled the car. Harry and Ron were still trapped in the icy nightmare of the Dementors, their faces drained of color. Fred and George rubbed numb fingers, trying to thaw them. Roger pressed his brow between his hands, thinking furiously. Dementors shouldn't be here. The whole scenario made no sense. If what the twins had guessed was true, something catastrophic had happened at Azkaban. Could Sirius Black have escaped early? Then Roger remembered the group photograph from Nicholas LeMay Manor, the one that had captured the rat Peter Pettigrew had become. Sirius must have seen that photo. He ran through variables and factional currents in his head as the car lurched over the last few miles. By the time the flying car wobbled down onto the grass at Ottery St. Catchpole, where the burrow stood, the horizon was paling with dawn. The trip had taken twice as long as it should have. The car door had barely creaked open when Mrs. Weasley exploded into the yard like an enraged lioness, sending the chickens scattering. Usually all smiles and warmth, she now wore blazing fury. Her floral apron and the wand tucked into its pocket did nothing to soften the look in her eyes. She was incandescent with worry. Hands on her hips, she stood in front of Ron, Fred, and George, scrutinizing each face as if trying to find the truth in them. Good morning, Mum." George forced a brittle smile, trying to break the oppressive tension. "Good morn, Ing." Molly Weasley's voice was low as thunder, every word wrapped in suppressed rage. "You actually took Roger out like this? And brought Harry back here? Do you have any idea what the situation is outside right now? Do you know how worried I was?" Her 3 sons wilted like frost-bitten vegetables, heads bowed in guilty silence. The beds were empty, not a single note left. The car was gone, at a time like this. Her voice broke with a small, frightened sob. "I was beside myself with worry. I was just about to run to the ministry." In the luxurious Malfoy Manor in Wiltshire, Lucius Malfoy lounged on a small balcony bathed in morning sun, enjoying a lavish breakfast. He had just drained a glass of mellow wine when a sudden, bone-deep pain shot through his left forearm. The agony was so violent he nearly dropped the glass. He jerked up the sleeve of his silk dressing gown. There, The once faded, dreadful mark of a skull and snake writhed beneath his pale skin, burning and resolving into a vivid, living image. The pain flared and lingered before slowly ebbing like a tide. Lucius sagged back into his carved chair, all strength gone, cold sweat darkening his silk. Before he had a chance to steady himself, a cold, sibilant voice cut through the still air of the balcony. Lucius, 12 years, and your life has been comfortably lived. Lucius, a veteran of the dark arts, had been trembling with pain and fear, but his reflexes were swift. He drew his wand from his sleeve and leveled it toward the voice. A figure stepped out of the shadows, and Lucius's pupils pinched shut. The blood in his veins seemed to freeze. Standing before him was his former master. No, his master, Lord Voldemort himself. The Dark Lord, whom Lucius had privately doubted would ever truly return, was now there in the flesh. All Lucius's skepticism collapsed into sheer terror and submissive instinct. Voldemort had taken his former form. With a cold, casual grace, he seated himself in the empty chair opposite Lucius. I noticed, Voldemort's red eyes fixed on Lucius's pale face, that you, unlike some other servants, do not seem eager to seek your missing master. Master! Lucius's voice trembled uncontrollably. Master, please understand. I have been preparing the way for you in secret, surveilling the ministry, watching Dumbledore. I have never abandoned your cause, not for a single moment. Voldemort's tone was flat, his face unreadable. That composure chilled Lucius deeper than any shout, the calm that usually foreshadowed a storm of wrath. Fear gripped him like an iron hand, making it hard to breathe. In a rush of desperate thought, he seized upon the one thing that might prove his loyalty. He flicked his wand. Accio! An ornate wooden box inlaid with black gems flew from the direction of the study and landed into his trembling hands. Lucius clutched the box like a lifeline and held it out with both hands. Master, the notebook you entrusted to me, I have guarded it as if it were my own life. Had you not come today, I meant to pass it down as the Malfoy house heirloom, kept for generations. This is my heart of loyalty to you. Voldemort's crimson eyes regarded the offering without blinking. The air on the balcony seemed to thicken. The pressure was almost suffocating. Lucius felt as though he might collapse until finally the Dark Lord spoke again. Very well, Lucius, I am pleased you kept your loyalty. Relief leaked out of Lucius in an unsteady exhale. He wiped cold sweat from his brow with a shaking hand. But before he could relax, Voldemort's voice coiled around him once more. Now I will require many sacrifices. He rose slowly, crossed the short distance, and reached with a pale, slender finger to take the wooden box. As a reward for your loyalty, wealth, glory, supreme power, I shall bestow them upon the house of Malfoy. Do you understand my meaning? After Harry moved into the burrow, the rhythm of life there stayed much the same, but to him every day felt like stepping into a new world. Mrs. Weasley fussed over him like a second mother. At the dinner table, she would pile extra sausages and fried eggs on his plate. She had heard how little he was given at his aunt's house. Between Ron, his inseparable best friend, and little Ginny, who kept sneaking adoring glances at him, everything about the burrow felt warm and novel. He found himself thinking, if only I could live here forever. The Weasleys, however, purposely kept news of Sirius Black's escape from Azkaban from him. They did not want Harry to worry, and they privately warned Ron, Fred, George, Percy, and Ginny that not a single word of it was to be mentioned in Harry's presence. That morning, the burrow was soon alive with the clamor of owls. 7 birds, each with its own errand, descended noisily on the kitchen windowsill, the dining table, and even the laundry line, scattering feathers and parchment. Harry, Ron, the twins, Percy, and Ginny all had letters among them. Arthur Weasley thumped a stack of envelopes in his hand and announced in a raised voice, "Right, children, look over your lists carefully. The situation is special this year, and it's dangerous outside, so we'll do our Diagon Alley shopping together, and only this once, understood?" Harry tore his envelope open and scanned the sheet inside. The usual details. September 1st, King's Cross Station, the Hogwarts Express. His eyes dropped to the book list. Besides the required standard book of spells, grade 2, there was another long list. 7 more titles, all by Gilderoy Lockhart. So the defense against the dark arts position had gone to Lockhart, just as in the stories. It made sense. Dumbledore had been absent all summer, leaving Professor McGonagall in charge. After a few notorious incidents, Nicholas Flamel's theft and the name of Quirrell becoming infamous, the DADA post was a poisoned chalice. Lockhart was probably the only eager applicant left. Whoa! You've got to buy the whole Lockhart set, too? Fred peered at Harry's list and whistled. Merlin's soggy socks. That lot's expensive. George leaned over as well, worriedly calculating how the family's coffers would stretch to cover textbooks for 5 children, plus Ginny's wand and a broom. Harry now realized that although Hogwarts was a school, it also had considerable resources. The Forbidden Forest and the Black Lake held many valuable magical assets, and the school received sizable subsidies from the ministry for housing the merpeople and the centaurs, along with other educational grants. So while Hogwarts covered much in terms of board and tuition, students still had to pay for uniforms, textbooks, and equipment, brooms, cauldrons, and the like. And the textbooks were set by the professors. If one happened to be a teacher who disliked textbooks, expenses could be minimal. But Professor Lockhart was clearly not that sort. Assigning 7 volumes, all his own bestsellers, was shameless self-promotion, and Hogwarts seemed content to let him. At last, the day for Diagon Alley arrived. Before dawn, Mrs. Weasley's booming voice called everyone up. After a hurried breakfast, they gathered by the fireplace in the sitting room. This time, thanks to a stroke of luck, Harry was not sent to Knockturn Alley. Flue powder was tossed into the flames, green fire roared, and one by one they vanished, arriving safely in Diagon Alley. Diagon Alley. The moment Roger stepped in, he noticed the difference. Though the street was still crowded, most people moved in groups of 3 or 5. Few witches or wizards wandered alone. Everyone seemed keyed up by the news of Sirius Black's escape. Near some recessed alleys, he could even see alert figures, definitely aurors, posted like sentries. People's first stop was Gringotts, where they withdrew cash. There they ran into Hermione's parents, who had just finished exchanging Muggle money. Mr. and Mrs. Granger were Muggle dentists, comfortable by Muggle standards, but when converted at the Ministry's exchange quota, the galleons they received barely covered Hermione's school expenses. From where Roger stood, it was obvious. Muggle currency was treated like loose paper in the wizarding world. The exchange rules functioned like a disguised subsidy for Muggle-born families. Despite all the talk of pure-blood supremacy and everyday prejudice, the Ministry's policy suggested it knew the value of Muggle-born witches and wizards. Unfortunately, Arthur Weasley's Muggle Protection Act had been stalled and then sunk in the tide of Cornelius Fudge's hostility toward Dumbledore. The reform was a casualty of politics. The mood across the magical community felt poised at a fragile crossroads. After Mrs. Weasley finished buying second-hand robes for Ginny, the whole crowd funneled into Flourish and Blots. Roger knew why. The first Horcrux belonging to Lord Voldemort was about to appear there. The bookshop was packed, inside and out, as if the fear of Sirius Black had been traded for a different kind of frenzy. A banner from a second-floor window made the reason plain. Gilderoy Lockhart book signing. The familiar spectacle unfolded. Lockhart, who had an eye for limelight, spotted Harry in the crowd. He gave a theatrical cry, seized Harry's arm, and dragged him forward. "The little savior has come to buy my books," he announced, then flashed his signature dazzling smile at the short photographer nearby and barked, "Quick, take more pictures." Lockhart turned to the crowd, drawing the sound like a magnet. "As you all know, the vile Sirius Black has escaped Azkaban," he intoned. "Clearly, even our Harry realizes it's time to brush up on defense against the dark arts. To honor the ancestors who fought dark wizards, I have decided to give Harry Potter a complete set of my works, free of charge." The photographer swooped and the camera's flash powder puffed clouds of smoke. The Weasleys coughed. A fan in the crowd shouted, "Mr. Lockhart, do you think Black's escape is aimed at Harry?" The place went dead silent. Harry looked bewildered. He knew nothing about any of this. Lockhart's smile widened as if the question had been scripted for him. "Ah, that is indeed the question," he said, then pivoted. He straightened, drawing dramatic tension. "But, my dear friends, rather than dwelling on that fugitive, I have exciting news. I, Gilderoy Lockhart, am honored to announce that I have been appointed Hogwarts Defense Against the Dark Arts professor for this school year. As long as I am at Hogwarts, I will never let anyone harm Harry Potter." His pronouncement ignited applause and cheers. Mrs. Weasley's face flushed with excitement. Roger and Hermione were squeezed toward the entrance. Roger's mind, however, was elsewhere. He had been waiting for Lucius Malfoy, planning to swipe the diary Horcrux as it was being planted among Ginny's old textbooks. He had long speculated about Horcruxes and had lacked both the chance and the materials for experiments. A diary that would soon be deliberately lost was suddenly the most convenient acquisition. Lockhart's eyes swept the crowd and fixed on Roger. He stared for a few seconds, then leapt forward as if discovering a new continent. "Merlin's beard! Look who this is! Roger Lewis!" he cried, the pitch of his voice jumping. The crowd turned and then made way, whispering. Lockhart, ever the reputation manager, saw gold. The Daily Prophet's eager reporters were already leaning in. Lockhart pictured tomorrow's front page, the boy Harry Potter and the prodigy Roger Lewis together at his signing. If not for Sirius Black stealing the headlines, this would have been explosive news. The youngest recipient ever of the Order of Merlin, first class in the making, before the world's eyes. Lockhart lunged, grabbed Roger's arm, dragged him forward, and shouted at the photographer, "Quick, take a picture of the two of us." Magnesium flashes danced again, nearly blinding flourish and blots. When the shutters fell, Lockhart sensed it wasn't enough. He cleared his throat and addressed the room with theatrical weight. "Ladies and gentlemen, allow me to introduce the young man at my side, the youngest candidate in magical history for the Order of Merlin, first class, Mr. Roger Lewis." After the initial murmur of shock and curiosity dimmed, Lockhart turned on the drama. "As you may have heard, regrettably, certain departments in the ministry are conducting a so-called academic misconduct investigation into Roger's extraordinary and revolutionary polymorphic transformation." He paused as if in anguish. Harry had been pushed into a corner, clutching a trembling armful of Lockhart's books beside Ginny. Lockhart straightened, chin up, and fulminated with righteous indignation. "In my view, this exposes the rancid, deep-rooted specter of pure-bloodism inside the ministry. They're persecuting a brilliant Muggle-born prodigy. I, Gilderoy Lockhart, hereby solemnly declare my opposition to this injustice." One must wonder, has the shadow of he who must not be named truly faded away? Silence slammed down again, thick as a silence charm. Then the crowd erupted into 10 times the chatter it had before. The photographer's hands shook with excitement as he pressed the shutter like a man possessed. Lockhart had just publicly attacked the ministry at the height of the Black Panic. He had elevated an academic inquiry into a matter of political persecution and pure-blood grievance, a lightning rod for the community's most sensitive nerves. Lockhart didn't seem to care about consequences. His only aim was louder headlines and brighter fame. Roger raised an eyebrow, half amused. No wonder his Order of Merlin nomination had stalled earlier in the year. It had been blocked at the ministry. But what could the office-bound bureaucrats find against a talent certified, in their own way, even by figures like Voldemort and Dumbledore? He smirked inwardly. Such certainties mattered little in the face of raw ambition and rumor. At that moment, the Malfoys, father and son, entered Flourish and Blots.